Japan is changing the military game with its latest technological advancements. The nation's new, never-before-seen weapons showcase Tokyo's dedication to enhancing its military capabilities and asserting its position in the region. Now, for any other nation, this wouldn't be such massive news, but for Japan, it is. But why? Well, the answer to the question doesn't have to do with the ingenuity and creativity behind these new weapons. After all, Japan has always been a nation of innovation, particularly in technology. The nation has gifted many remarkable achievements to the world so far. No, the oddity of these new weapons has to do with the nature of the weapons themselves. You see, after the devastation of World War II, Japan largely adopted a pacifist stance. This was even enshrined in Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, which renounced the right to wage war and even prohibited the maintenance of land, sea, and air forces. But World War II is far behind us, and new dangers loom on the horizon. Dangers that have prompted Japan to reinterpret Article 9 in 2015, allowing the nation to exercise the right of collective self-defense. But Japan didn't stop there. Toward the end of 2022, it officially adopted a new national security strategy that focuses on building Japan's counter-strike capabilities used to preempt enemy attacks. This brings us to the 5 new weapons that have the potential to reshape the power balance in East Asia. But what are these weapons, and how can they help Japan make a difference in the region? Those are just some of the questions this video will have to answer. Before tackling them, it's important to answer a few other questions to explain such a drastic change in Japan's defense posture. Number 1. Why did this change even happen? What made Japan shift gears toward a more offensive security strategy? Well, based on the title of this video alone, you can probably guess at least one factor in Japan's decision: China. Japan has repeatedly flagged China, the country's hostile neighbor, as its biggest strategic challenge. But believe it or not, China's actions weren't what triggered Japan's new military policy, well, at least not directly. The primary culprit is actually Russia. And no, this doesn't have to do with the Kuril Islands dispute between Russia and Japan. It has to do with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, you might wonder how a war some 5,000 miles away from Japan could possibly influence the country's military decisions. Well, it's simple really. We'll let a retired Japanese Air Self-Defense Force General, Toshimichi Nagawa, explain it in his own words. The Ukraine war has shown us the necessity of being able to sustain a fight, and that's something Japan has not so far been prepared for. He then added that Japan is quite late in the game, comparing it to being 200 meters behind in a 400-meter sprint. The war in Ukraine has completely shattered Japan's perception of what a potential military conflict in the region might look like. It's now clear that such a conflict would neither be fast, nor clean, nor easy. This newfound realization made it question its faith in its current security environment and military equipment. One thing became abundantly clear: Japan was nowhere near ready to successfully defend its sovereignty with its current military supplies. So the nation had 2 options: 1. Purchase the missing weapons, or 2. Make them. Given Japan's history of technological advancements, it shouldn't be surprising that option 2 looked more appealing. With option number 2, Japan could gather all the right equipment to prevail in a prolonged conflict within the next 5 years. And where there's conflict, there's China. There's a reason why Russia's war on Ukraine sparked so much fear in Japan. The situation hits pretty close to home. How so? The answer is a single word: Taiwan. You see, tensions have long existed between Japan and China in the East China Sea. However, these tensions reached boiling point when Japan declared that it would support the US in defending Taiwan's sovereignty and freedom against China. Japan has since cooperated with Taiwan in numerous fields, including national defense and security, trade, and industrial transformation. As you can imagine, China wasn't too thrilled about this. The country's response: a massive military buildup in the Pacific. China's military isn't just sitting idly by. The People's Liberation Army has also been conducting military drills in the East China Sea, firing off missiles left and right. Interestingly, China has this in common with another country that's prompted Japan to arm itself like never before: North Korea. Besides China's increasing military might, North Korea's rampant nuclear and missile developments are another major cause for concern on Japan's part. Japan's 2023 Defense White Paper underscored just how concerning North Korea has become, labeling it a security threat bigger than ever before. According to the paper, Japan believes that North Korea can attack the country with nuclear weapons fitted to ballistic missiles. It wasn't hard for the paper to reach this conclusion. After all, North Korea keeps firing ballistic missiles into the sea off its east coast, which, coincidentally, is the direction toward Japan. Of course, North Korea labels these firings as test launches, but this does little to allay Japan's concerns. So what's Japan doing about it? Ratcheting up its military budget. In 2023, Japan's Ministry of Defense requested a record-high defense budget for 2024, totaling $52.9 billion. The most notable requests within this budget are as follows: $2.6 billion for a pair of Aegis system-equipped vessels aiming to bolster Japan's ballistic missile defense capabilities, $1.2 billion for the construction of a new class of frigates, $739.3 million for the acquisition of 8 F-35A, a variant of the American Lockheed Martin F-35 Lightning II fighter, $862.3 million for the acquisition of 7 F-35B short takeoff and vertical landing fighters, $83 million for the construction of 8 Mitsubishi F-2 multi-role fighters, $561 million for the purchase of fighting vehicles and tanks, and $215.4 million for the procurement of 28 wheeled armored personnel carriers. Now, with a closer inspection of this list, you might notice two things. One, the largest individual requests have to do with bolstering the capabilities of Japan's Navy, the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, JMSDF. Also, the country's naval capabilities are the only ones where Japan is choosing the production route 100% instead of importing the necessary weapons. Given that Japan's biggest dangers, China and North Korea, come primarily from the sea, this strategic decision shouldn't be surprising. Japan has one primary goal: for its naval force to pack a punch. That's why all the 5 new Japanese weapons this video discusses focus on enhancing the country's naval capabilities. All the details for these weapons were disclosed in the defense budget request we've previously discussed. So without further ado, let's dive into the 5 new weapons that will undoubtedly make Japan's adversaries sweat. First up, a combat support multi-purpose unmanned surface vessel, USV. Now that's a lot of words, so let's break down what each one means, starting from the end. As the name suggests, an unmanned surface vessel doesn't require a crew on board. Instead, it can be remotely controlled or operated autonomously, or in the case of this Japanese vessel, both. That's right, this new vehicle could operate autonomously and be controlled remotely from a land-based control facility via satellite communications. The former option is mostly reserved for rough weather, when the remote control system might experience difficulties. The same goes for any malfunctioning of this system. This will be made possible by the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning, which should significantly boost the vessel's decision-making capabilities as well as its overall performance. The multi-purpose part of the vessel's name is also pretty self-explanatory. This vessel will be able to perform various missions. This includes reconnaissance, surveillance, and combat. As far as the last mission goes, this technological marvel is expected to counter enemy ships and submarines. However, a key piece of information is missing here. The actions of this vessel will primarily support Japanese manned vessels, hence the name Combat Support Vessel. As the manned vessel advances, its unmanned support will be able to share operational data and other relevant information with other USVs with the goal of coordinating their activities. It's a pretty smart vessel, isn't it? This smart USV will also be able to replace its payloads depending on the mission. For combat, it might employ sensors to spot enemy ships and missiles, and torpedoes to deal with them. If the situation gets sticky, this vessel can evade enemy threats by submerging itself in the water. That's right, we're talking about a hybrid, a half-surface, half-underwater vessel. As for the physical characteristics, this stealthy USV is expected to be about 100 feet long and displace about 200 tons. It will use electric propulsion and fuel cells to power its operations, making it more enduring and quieter than traditional diesel-powered vessels. There's just one more question left to answer. When will this naval wonder be ready for action? Not anytime soon, just like the remaining 4 weapons. If everything goes according to plan, this vessel should be researched from 2024 to 26 and tested from 27 to 30. As for action, the exact date still remains to be seen. However, given that the Japanese MOD believes this vessel will greatly enhance the survivability of the Japanese naval forces in the future, it's likely that no time will be wasted. Next up, another unmanned weapon, but this time we're discussing Japan's planned unmanned amphibious vehicle, UAV. Interestingly, this vehicle is sort of a package deal. It's being designed to support the Manned Assault Amphibious Vehicle, AAV, whose development is already underway by Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. If you're unfamiliar with Japan's military industry, you might wonder what Mitsubishi, which is best known for its cars and electronics, is doing in the defense sector. Well, actually, Mitsubishi has a long history of involvement in this industry, which some Japanese people don't even know about. In fact, many of the weapons mentioned in this video, as well as those that are yet to be mentioned, are being built by this engineering giant. But back to the AAV. The AAV is a fully tracked vehicle capable of traveling on both land and water and carrying up to 21 troops and 3 crew members. The main purpose of this vehicle is to allow Japanese troops to swiftly deploy from ships to shore during amphibious assault operations. However, there's a catch. You see, landing on enemy-held lands, or in this case, mostly islands, isn't always a smooth ride. The troops can be met with a variety of challenges, with hostile fire arguably being the most dangerous one. Now, traditional AAVs typically respond by increasing their speed to minimize the time spent in the danger zone. However, this isn't enough to guarantee the safety of troops in enemy lands. That's where the new unmanned amphibious vehicle comes into play. The primary goal of this vehicle is to land on enemy-held territory ahead of the AAV and secure it for the ensuing crew. In addition, this vehicle will be able to transport supplies after the initial landing, ensuring that the troops have the necessary resources to establish a secure foothold on enemy territory. Considering how delicate these missions are, it shouldn't be surprising that this unmanned amphibious vehicle will be packed with advanced features. For starters, it can be both controlled remotely and operated autonomously, like the first vessel we discussed. As with the combat support vessel, the autonomous decision-making will be powered by artificial intelligence, while remote control will rely on satellite communications coming from a land-based control facility. Another similar characteristic is that this vehicle will be able to communicate and coordinate with other UAVs as well as other AAVs, thus forming a handy network of amphibious platforms. When it comes to appearance, the UAV will look pretty similar to the AAV in terms of shape and size. It will also rely on the same electronic power assist technology to make its chassis more compact. Why is this important? Well, the islands of Japan are packed with reefs. For the UAV to have any chance of navigating these treacherous waters successfully, it needs to be able to maneuver effectively and avoid getting stuck or damaged on the reefs. That's what this compact chassis and more powerful propulsion are for. With them, the UAV should have no problem reaching the limited points for landing. This skillful vehicle has the same development timeline as the first vehicle on our list, prototyping from 2024 to 26 and then testing from 27 to 30. The third weapon on our list is technically not a new weapon. It's a variant of an existing state-of-the-art weapon that the JMSDF has been deploying since 2012. So let's talk about the OG weapon first. The advanced weapon in question is the Type 12 torpedo, whose goal is to counter enemy submarine threats. The Type 12 torpedo is a highly versatile weapon that can be launched from various platforms, including helicopters, maritime patrol aircraft, and surface vessels like destroyers. With a 30-mile range and 50-knot speed, the Type 12 is one of the most advanced torpedoes in the world. So why change it? Well, the plan isn't to change it, it's to upgrade it. The JMSDF plans to convert the Type 12 torpedo into an anti-torpedo torpedo, ATT, by adding the ability to neutralize high-speed torpedoes launched from enemy vessels. This addition was born out of necessity. Previously, the JMSDF was only equipped with the soft kill capabilities. These capabilities allow neutralizing torpedoes through acoustic jammers and decoys. Basically, these devices would create false targets and generate noise to divert or entirely mislead enemy torpedoes. However, the soft kill means soon became obsolete. But how so? Well, Japan is dealing with some pretty advanced naval powers in the East China Sea. So it's no wonder these powers quickly developed new, high-performance torpedoes that can evade or resist the traditional counter-torpedo measures the JMSDF uses. They do so by relying on sophisticated sensors to filter out the distractions and continue pursuing their real targets. Since soft kill measures were no longer enough, the JMSDF has only one option: develop hard kill capabilities. And that's precisely what the new and upgraded version of the Type 12 torpedo represents. This anti-torpedo weapon won't just divert enemy torpedoes, it will physically destroy them. However, to do that successfully, the ATT must detect the enemy torpedo early on. That's why the JMSDF is also working on upgrading the sonar capabilities on destroyers that will be equipped with these new ATTs. This involves making the sonar more sensitive, improving its resolution, and boosting its range and coverage. As soon as the improved sonar detects an incoming threat, it will transmit the information to the ATT's launch tubes, resulting in an immediate launch. The result? Bye-bye enemy torpedo. ATTs are expected to enter into service a little earlier than the first two weapons mentioned, as their testing should conclude in 2029. However, should is the key word here, as the ATTs must pass a number of tests involving different scenarios and conditions to prove their effectiveness. This involves testing them against different torpedo types and numbers, launching them at various depths and distances, and introducing unexpected environmental factors. If the ATT passes all these tests with flying colors, one thing's for sure, the JMSDF will have a mighty new weapon in its arsenal that will significantly enhance its maritime security capabilities. The same goes for the next weapon on our list, but this time we're dealing with another type of weapon and another type of enemy. The weapon in question is a detection system called the Glide Phase Interceptor (GPI), and the enemy it's supposed to take out is any hypersonic weapon. The potential deployment of this missile would be huge news for Japan, but why? Because the country has long struggled to find a way to respond to hypersonic weapons that have changed the war game. In Japan's case, this particularly applies to weapons targeting naval vessels like the Hypersonic Glide Vehicle (HGV) and Anti-Ship Ballistic Missile (ASBM). Coincidentally, these are the missiles that are increasingly tested by Japan's adversaries close to its shores, and these missiles spell nothing but bad news. They can fly at speeds exceeding Mach 5, which is 5 times the speed of sound. They can also change course at random, making it nearly impossible to intercept them. But even if they continue toward their intended target, they can do so at incredibly high speeds even while maneuvering, allowing them to evade detection and missile defenses. Certainly not a weapon you want heading your way. So how does Japan plan to deal with these impossibly fast and maneuverable hypersonic weapons? The answer to this question does involve the Glide Phase Interceptor, developed in cooperation with the US. However, it also involves a native system that consists of 2 primary components. Number 1, a multi-band radar. Japan is developing a new type of radar whose primary goal is to detect small, high-speed, and highly maneuverable targets with unparalleled precision. It's called multiband because it will use 2 bands of different frequencies to improve detection accuracy and reliability. The first, the S-band, will detect distant targets. The second, the X-band, will deal with those relatively close. This versatility also carries to the radar's design. Namely, this radar will be scalable, allowing it to be deployed on various platforms. Besides being more accurate, reliable, and flexible, this radar will also be more powerful. This will be made possible by gallium nitride technology, which is known for its high electron mobility and stability at high frequencies, making it ideal for use in radar systems. This technology will allow the radar to transmit and receive signals more efficiently, enhancing its overall performance. The performance in question will be tested from 2029 to 30, after the period of 5 years needed to develop this mighty device. The second component that should help Japan in its relentless battle against hypersonic weapons is a new Combat Management System, CMS. This system is designed specifically for destroyers, and it should allow seamless control and coordination of various sensors and weapons aboard the vessel. When it comes to the design of this new CMS, Japan has 2 goals. 1. Make it scalable. This will allow Japan's military to integrate new equipment in the future as new technological advancements and new threats emerge. This goal is achieved through using an open architecture that allows for easy integration of new technologies in the future. And 2. Make it as autonomous as possible. Through the use of AI and machine learning, Japan hopes to enable this system to make accurate decisions without relying on people, or at least relying on as few people as possible. Now, this goal has a pretty gloomy background. You see, Japan's population is rapidly shrinking. Though the country currently boasts about 125 million people, this number is expected to fall to 63 million by 2100. Though the Japanese government is doing everything in its power to prevent this, the country's military must be prepared for this unfortunate scenario. The preparation, of course, includes developing technologies that require fewer people to operate efficiently, as our list has made abundantly clear. Like most of the other weapons on this list, the CMS is also expected to complete the testing phase around 2030, after being prototyped between 2024 and 28. That means that in roughly 6 years, Japan could have a way to protect its territory and interests against the growing threat of hypersonic weapons. This is especially important for the country, as China is widely believed to have the most advanced technology in this sector. However, the 4th weapon on our list will only allow Japan to detect supersonic weapons and coordinate defense. But what about actually destroying these weapons? That's the job for the 5th and final weapon on our list, a ship-to-air missile. Now, it's important to make a distinction. Ship-to-air missiles already exist, and they're referred to as SAM missiles. Japan will simply develop its own version of this missile, which is referred to as NSAM, an acronym for the new ship-to-air missile. The NSAM won't just be a new version of the SAM missile, it will also be an improved one. These improvements will affect 3 components. Number 1, the seeker. The Seeker is the device that detects and tracks the target, thus guiding the missile toward it. Thanks to a combination of infrared and radar sensors, the improved Seeker will be able to better detect and track supersonic weapons, even if they're flying at high altitudes, at high speeds, or on irregular trajectories. Whatever the case, the NSAM will be able to adjust its course accordingly. Number 2. Side thrusters. The NSAM will contain side thrusters whose job is to improve its maneuverability at high altitudes, where it has less control. These components are basically small rockets attached to the sides of the missile, making it more agile and responsive. And number 3, the Fire Control System, FCS. Now, to be fair, this component isn't directly attached to the NSAM. However, it still plays a crucial role in guiding this missile to its target, in this case, the hypersonic enemy. The FCS is essentially a software program that calculates the trajectory, speed, and direction of the NSAM in real time, ensuring it stays on course to intercept its target accurately. So how will this component be upgraded? It will become more accurate and more capable of handling complex scenarios involving a wide variety of threats. Interestingly, this will only be made possible by the development of the fourth weapon on our list. The data received from the radar and the CMS will allow the NSAM's FCS to make more precise targeting decisions in real time. The advanced NSAM is expected a little later than the other weapons on our list. There are 2 reasons for this. Firstly, it depends on the fourth system on the list, which needs to be fully operational before the NSAM can be deployed. And secondly, it's planned to be installed on the new types of destroyers that won't be built before 2031. However, if the NSAM offers Japan some peace of mind when it comes to hypersonic weapons, it's absolutely worth the wait. And there you have it, the 5 new weapons that promise to revolutionize Japan's maritime defense capabilities. Interestingly, most Japanese people oppose increased military spending on these and other weapons and systems, though to be fair, the percentage of those supporting this spending was significantly lower just 6 years ago. In 2018, about 29% of Japanese people supported increased military spending. In 2023, this figure rose to 40%. Though these people are still in the minority, it's clear that there's a shifting attitude toward military spending, reflecting changing perceptions of Japan's defense needs. But what do you think? Do you think Japan's increased military spending is warranted? Is a war in East Asia truly on the horizon? If so, which of these new Japanese weapons has the best chance of making a difference? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments section below. Now go and check out why Japan's military power terrifies China, or click this other video instead. Guess who's back in the military spotlight? Japan's shaking off its peaceful image and stepping into some serious boots, aiming to become a major player in the defense game again. With neighbors casting nervous glances and an assertive China on the rise, Japan's move is stirring up the waters in East Asia. Today, we're diving into what's behind Japan's big pivot from pacifism, checking out their shiny new military toys, and seeing how old rivals are reacting to this plot twist. It's a story of transformation, tension, and alliances in the making. Join us as we uncover how Japan is rewriting its role on the regional stage, challenging the status quo, and maybe, just maybe, changing the game for good. But first, let's delve into the intriguing history of Japan's rise to power, setting the stage to peel back the layers of today's geopolitical shifts pushing Tokyo out of its strategic shell. What's driving this dramatic change, and why now? To understand, let's turn our attention to Japan's most formidable neighboring giant, China. The rise of China since it opened up following Mao's death, and particularly since it joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, has severely disrupted the international balance of power in East Asia. Between 2002 and 2022, China's economy grew by an average of 8.8% per year. In contrast, Japan grew only at an average rate of 0.65%, entering sharp recessions between 2008 and 2009, and again between 2019 and 2020. In 2010, China surpassed Japan as the largest economy in Asia and the second largest in the world. The new economic order inevitably meant a new military one. In 2002, Japan was ahead of China in military spending, with the former spending about $40 billion, the second most in the world, to China's $30 billion. That changed fast. China became the world's second largest military spender in 2007, a spot it's not relinquished since. In 2022, China spent almost $300 billion on its military, which was 5.5 times Japan's expenditure at about $54 billion. The true number is likely higher than that. as the United States Department of Defense noted that China's real military budget is likely between 1.1 and 2 times higher than its official figures suggest. This would increase the gap between China and Japan to 11.2 times at maximum interpretation. China has used its new military might to build the world's largest navy by sheer number of vessels, modernize its air force, increase its nuclear stockpile, and build an arsenal of thousands of ballistic and cruise missiles. All of these assets severely threaten Japan's national security, and China has demonstrated a willingness to use them. In nearby seas and skies, China has cranked up its gray zone operations against the Senkaku Islands and Taiwan. In 2016, a Chinese naval vessel entered the 12 nautical mile territorial sea around the Senkaku Islands for the first time. Previously, only Chinese Coast Guard ships had done so. In 2018, a Chinese submarine did the same. In 2020, Chinese Coast Guard ships operated near the Senkaku Islands for 111 consecutive days, and 333 for all of 2020. In February 2021, Beijing enacted a new law authorizing the Chinese Coast Guard to use force against foreign vessels in maritime areas under Chinese jurisdiction. Conveniently, this includes the Senkakus, which China claims are its Diaoyu Islands. In 2022 and 23, China conducted a series of large naval and air exercises off Taiwan. As part of these operations, some missiles entered Japan's airspace and waters. Further afield, China's military expansion in the South China Sea threatens to cut the shipping lanes that Japan depends on. In 2022, Japan imported 25.3% of its GDP and exported 21.5%. 42% of this maritime trade passes through the South China Sea. Among the most important of these resources is oil going through the Strait of Malacca from the Persian Gulf. Though less pronounced than China's, the threat posed by North Korea's nuclear ballistic missile program, the latter of which frequently violates Japanese airspace, also poses a significant challenge for Tokyo. Japan also shares a maritime border with Russia, which became more aggressive against its neighbors under Vladimir Putin, ultimately leading to a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Tokyo and Moscow also dispute control over the southernmost Kuril Islands. Some policymakers in Japan have described their country as being on the front lines in the face of these aggressive authoritarian nations. In response to these developments, the Japanese government under Prime Minister Fumio Kishida announced in November 2022 that it would increase defense spending to reach 2% of GDP by April 2027. While the reaction to this development was positive in the United States and among its Western allies, the response in the region was much more surprising. Some of the nations Japan has traditionally been at odds with, like South Korea, welcomed the move, if tepidly. Why is this development so surprising, and what implications could it have for Japan's influence in the region? To grasp the full impact, we need to delve into Japan's historically tense relationships with its neighbors. For most of its history, Japan was an isolationist country. Being an island nation, it could afford to be. Japanese warriors fought each other far more frequently than they fought foreign enemies. Prior to World War II, only one foreign power ever attempted to attack the Japanese home islands. This was the Mongol Empire under Kublai Khan in 1274 and 1281. Both of these attempts were short-lived failures, and Japan kept to its own devices for 3 more centuries. Still, Japan displayed an early willingness to learn from foreigners that would prove critical for its national trajectory later on. We'll get to that soon. When Portuguese traders brought firearms to Japan, the country's warriors quickly adapted to them. This was the country's Sengoku period, the span between the mid-15th and early 17th centuries that saw the decline of Japan's previous central government under the Ashikaga shogunate and the rise of ambitious and powerful feudal lords known as daimyo, who saw their chance to increase their wealth, power, and influence. In this era, Japan was one of the most militarized and dangerous places in the world, with more frequent and intense fighting than any other country. Hundreds of thousands of people likely died. Even so, Japan's militarism was contained strictly within its island borders. That changed radically in the 1590s. By then, the country had been brought to a period of relative peace thanks to the efforts of 2 of Japan's so-called 3 unifiers, Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi. However, Japan was still a heavily militarized society, and the peace at home was precarious, especially with Hideyoshi's lowly origins and lack of an heir of military age. In 1592, Japan abandoned its isolationism and invaded Korea. Hideyoshi apparently expected an easy campaign that would help consolidate his control over Japan, not least of which by removing many dangerous samurai that could rebel against him. On land, he was correct, as better armed and battle-hardened Japanese soldiers easily defeated their Korean foes. Although historians debate the grandness of Hideyoshi's ambitions, he made overtures of conquering Ming China, demanding tribute from the Spanish colonial government in the Philippines, and even moving onward to India. We will never know how serious he was about these ideas, but they did anticipate things to come, and it was the beginning of a long-running historical animosity between Korea and Japan. Hideyoshi's successor as the ruler of Japan was Tokugawa Ieyasu, who returned the country to its traditional isolationism. For 250 years, Japan remained at peace and cut itself off from the rest of the world. The only foreigners allowed to enter the country were Dutch traders at the port of Dejima near Nagasaki. It brought short-term benefits, but this policy nearly proved disastrous at a time when the power of the European empires was growing. In 1839, the First Opium War began in China. This marked the start of what the Chinese government considers today their country's century of humiliation. China was defeated, and subsequent defeats forced the Qing dynasty into unequal treaties with the Western powers. Japan proved much more adaptable. Although isolated, Japanese officials and scholars were interested in the Western knowledge the Dutch traders brought with them, and they remained informed of events abroad. When the American Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Japan in 1853, the Japanese understood that they were at a hopeless disadvantage. Wanting to avoid the fate of China at all costs, forward-thinking leaders in Japan agreed to trade treaties with the West on far more equal terms than those imposed on China. They also ended the Tokugawa shogunate and built a modern industrial state under the authority of the Emperor Meiji in a period known as the Meiji Restoration. Japan successfully modernized and therefore avoided being colonized or dictated to by the Western powers. Indeed, the country's rise to international power in the late 19th century was phenomenal. To prove the point, it defeated the Qing dynasty in the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894–95 and annexed the island of Formosa, modern Taiwan, to its authority. It also forced Qing China to recognize the Korean peninsula as being in Japan's sphere of influence. After its victory over Russia in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904–1905, the Western powers tacitly acknowledged Japan as the hegemon of Northeast Asia and did not interfere in the sphere of influence it had created for itself. Japan had once again ended its isolationism and achieved a level of power only supposedly imagined in Hideyoshi's wildest dreams. With this success behind it, Japan was in a position to launch its bid for domination of the wider Indo-Pacific region. Under the umbrella of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, Japan hoped to solidify its hegemony over all of East Asia, pushing out both Western imperialism and communism. However, Japan's defeat in World War II ended these ambitions. The country's post-war constitution explicitly renounced war or even the threat of war as a legitimate function of the new Japanese state. Constitutionally, Japan may only maintain a military force adequate to its self-defense. For the rest of its geopolitical security, it would rely on its new ally, the United States, whose military was stationed in the country partially as a way of preventing Japan's strategic resurgence. For decades, this arrangement kept East Asia in a state of relative peace, but even so, Japan's neighbors never forgot the country's aggressive foreign policy, both under its previous Meiji regime between 1889 and 1947, and in some cases, the much more remote Sengoku period. Japan still remained a significant regional player. It was until 2010 the largest economy in Asia and had a huge soft power presence through the power of its popular entertainment industry. Despite this, anti-Japanese sentiment remains strong, which was one of the reasons why Tokyo resisted rearmament for such a long time. Even with the hawkish policies of Shinzo Abe, who was in power for a record 9 years between two terms, Japan proved institutionally reluctant to a major shift in its post-World War II defense posture. Although Abe increased military spending, he did not do so in a way that radically departed from his predecessors. Abe had more success in loosening the strict interpretation of Japan's Article 9. In 2015, the PM pushed legislation through the country's parliament that recognized Japan's right to be involved in collective self-defense with its allies, meaning that it could deploy its military overseas to assist its allies in the event of hostilities. Although this move was welcomed by the United States, it set off deep doubts among other countries in Asia, especially in the Northeast. Nevertheless, it's arguable that Abe was making a smart bet with his plans to expand Japan's military power. The shift in the region's geopolitical balance and the way Japan remade itself in the decades after World War II also meant a gradual shift in public sentiment toward the prospect of a more capable Japanese military in the region. For example, in the late 1970s, Japan began its Fukuda doctrine of reaching out to the Southeast Asian nations by reiterating its pacifism and emphasizing a more equal relationship. This helped to improve relations with those countries until Japan was viewed positively. In 2015, both China and Japan were viewed favorably by a majority of the public in the region, according to a Pew Scientific survey of over 15,300 people. Over 80% of the public in Malaysia, Vietnam, and the Philippines viewed Japan favorably, while 71% of Indonesians did. Such views of Japan in the areas it formerly occupied reflects the effectiveness of the Fukuda Doctrine and Tokyo's soft power strategy. Still further north, in the area with the deepest historical experience with Japan, views were far different. Only 25% of South Koreans and 12% of Chinese viewed Japan favorably. That same year, another Pew study revealed that 61% of South Koreans viewed China favorably, 78% of Malaysians, 63% of Indonesians, and even 54% of Filipinos did. But the Vietnamese had a sharply negative 74% disapproval rating of China, and 89% of the Japanese public did. By 2023, when the results of China's more aggressive foreign policy had become more apparent, the situation changed sharply. In that year's Pew survey, 77% of South Koreans viewed China unfavorably. Approval in Indonesia also dropped dramatically, with a 49% favorable and 25% unfavorable rating. Japan, meanwhile, largely maintained its favorable ratings. A 2023 poll of ASEAN countries by the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs revealed that 93% of those surveys had a favorable view of Japan. 91% valued the country's role as an upholder of peace and stability in the region, and 88% said Japan was a peace-loving nation in the decades since the end of World War II. Doubts remained. Taiwan and South Korea, the two countries with the deepest historical experience of being occupied by Japan, were the most hostile. Even in 2020, President Tsai Ing-wen saw criticism for tweeting in Japanese during her re-election campaign. However, for a Taiwan constantly under threat from a mainland Chinese regime that has repeatedly said that reunification is not optional, there has been little choice but to embrace Japan. A 2022 survey by the Japan-Taiwan Exchange Association's Taipei office, essentially the Japanese embassy in Taiwan, revealed that 60% of respondents said Japan was the country they could trust the most, which was up by 10 points from the previous study done in 2018. 60% also chose Japan as their favorite foreign country. The shift in attitude is more pronounced among younger cohorts. Of Japan's neighbors, relations with South Korea are the most complicated. They grew worse even as China's intentions to unilaterally overthrow the status quo in the region became clear. In 2019, Japan announced it would no longer consider South Korea a favored trading partner and imposed export controls on electronic components that are vital for major South Korean companies like Samsung. The move came after diplomatic and court battles involving Japan's atrocities in Korea during the colonization period between 1910 and 1945. South Koreans responded to Japan's move with a widespread boycott. However, relations between the two began to mend with the election of Yoon Suk-yeol to the South Korean presidency in 2022. In the summer of 2023, Yoon and Kishida met with Biden at Camp David. There, they released a statement committing to a new era of cooperation, including annual meetings at the summit and ministerial levels on security and economic matters. The shift marked an end to South Korea's previous policy of trying to deepen economic ties with China while maintaining its security alignment with the United States. With such wins behind it, Tokyo could begin its new military buildup on firmer footing in the region. When the Kishida government announced its intentions for Japan's military, reaction in the region was not as hostile as it would have been a few years earlier. For example, in Thailand, a country not occupied during the war but forced into alliance with it, state media reacted in a mixed manner. It warned Japan to be extremely careful, as if this trend continues unabated, it could backfire and rekindle old flames. Nevertheless, the Thais praised Japan for strengthening its maritime security operation with Vietnam, the Philippines, and Indonesia. In South Korea, public reaction was more negative, with some media sources fearing that Japan's new offensive capabilities would lead to unwelcome military involvement on the Korean peninsula. Nevertheless, South Korea's foreign ministry was much more receptive to the announcement than it would have been a year earlier, while warning that Tokyo must get its consent before taking any action that would gravely affect Seoul's national interests, such as using its new counter-strike capability around the Korean peninsula. The South Koreans nevertheless said that it was desirable for Japan to implement a security policy that would contribute to regional stability. In August 2023, the United States, South Korea, and Japan showcased their united front with joint ballistic missile defense drills in the East China Sea, a direct response to North Korea's botched satellite launch. Fast forward 2 months, and the trio unveiled their inaugural trilateral aerial drill. But Japan's strategic alliances stretch beyond this triad. It's fortifying relationships across the region. As a pivotal player in the Quad, alongside the United States, Australia, and India, Japan actively engages in exercises like Malabar, reinforcing its military footprint. A testament to this expanding reach is the deployment of Japanese F-35 jets to Australia, marking a new chapter of defense cooperation. Japan's web of security partnerships isn't just growing, it's evolving, knitting a stronger fabric of regional defense with Southeast Asia as its latest thread. But how is it doing this, and what does this mean for the future of Asia-Pacific security? In 2016, despite the overtures then-President Rodrigo Duterte made to China, Japan, and the Philippines signed an agreement allowing the transfer of defense equipment. In 2023, this bore fruit, with the Philippines purchasing a Mitsubishi electronic warning and radar control system. In April 2022, Japan and the Philippines agreed to expand their partnership and conduct more joint military drills. In November 2023, Japan and Vietnam agreed to deepen their bilateral security cooperation, including the potential for the former to transfer military equipment to the latter. The next month, Japan and Malaysia announced they would elevate their relationship to a comprehensive strategic partnership. This announcement included the signing of a new security deal worth $2.8 million to help Malaysia's maritime security. Equipment provisions included supplies and rescue boats, and according to Malaysian sources, monitoring and surveillance equipment. Many of these new partnerships are part of Japan's Overseas Security Assistance Program, which is part of its new regional security strategy. This is an understated break from its post-World War II foreign policy, which forbade Tokyo from using international aid for military purposes. Other partner countries in the OSA include Fiji and Bangladesh. While this program forbids the transfer of lethal equipment, there's no guarantee that prohibition will remain in place in the future, should policymakers in Tokyo consider the transfer of lethal aid to be warranted. Perhaps the best way to sum up the situation comes from the same Thai state media source we mentioned earlier. It must be clear today that the Japan with which Southeast Asia has been familiar throughout the post-war years is no longer the same. The past 70 years of a docile Japan are no more. The news that Japan would be ending its strategic retreat would in prior years be met with great alarm in East Asia. However, the times are changing fast. Because of the success of its economic partnerships and the flowering of its soft power, Japan was able to improve or mend relations with nations it once abused, and the rise of a newly aggressive China has left these less powerful nations with little choice but to align with Japan. While the new weapons it's arming itself with might get the most attention, the broader military context is that Japan is gradually ending its hard power isolation. With its new military hardware at home and security partnerships abroad, including with partners that might have been unthinkable a few years ago, Japan is poised to be a regional military powerhouse, and this time with a much more positive reception among its neighbors. What do you think about Japan's military buildup and the security partnerships it's made with its neighbors? Is Japan about to reclaim its place as the leading military power in East Asia? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Now go and check out how the Ukrainian conflict is reshaping Japan's defense strategy, or click this other video instead. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more military analysis from military experts. In December 2022, Japan, a nation with a long warrior tradition, increased its defense budget for the coming year by 26.3%, the largest single hike on record, to 1.19% of the country's GDP. Tokyo has also announced its intention to increase the defense budget to 2% of GDP by 2027, thereby building a modern military capable of conducting offensives and fighting far away from the Japanese homeland. Why the change? Let's take a look at the reasons behind Japan's re-emergence as a military power in its neighborhood and what it could mean for the future of the Indo-Pacific region. During the Cold War and the unipolar moment that followed the Soviet Union's collapse, Japan was not near the fault lines of the world's geopolitical tectonic plates. As such, it could afford its pacifistic posture while being comfortable under the security umbrella provided by its American ally. This began to change after China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. Once China joined the WTO, it accrued vast wealth and surpassed Japan as the world's second largest economy within a decade. With such a treasure trove on hand, China began an extensive military buildup and became more assertive with its territorial claims abroad. These claims directly conflicted with Japan's national security and territorial integrity. The first example of Japan's tensions with China comes in the Senkaku Islands dispute. These islands, which Japan administers but which China calls the Diaoyu and claims sovereignty over, are uninhabited but plentiful in natural resources. The East China Sea around them may have as many as 200 million barrels of oil and between 1 and 2 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. The Senkaku Islands are also surrounded by rich fisheries. The islands have geostrategic value as well. The Senkakus are part of the first island chain that encircles China's territory and prevents it from projecting power into the Pacific. They are also close to Taiwan. If China takes them and can militarize the Senkaku Islands, it will extend its reach much further afield and threaten Japanese and Taiwanese airspace. According to official Japanese sources, the Senkaku Islands were incorporated into the country's territory in 1895, after it was determined that there was no evidence of control there by another state. Japan temporarily lost these islands after its defeat in World War II. The Senkakus then fell under the administration of the United States as part of its occupation of Okinawa, which was recognized by the San Francisco Peace Treaty of 1951. However, the 1972 Okinawa Reversion Agreement returned the Senkakus to Japan. The country's foreign ministry claims that these points are proof that the islands are rightfully administered by Japan in accordance with recognized international law. The Japanese foreign ministry also says that China did not contest the islands until 1975, when their hydrocarbon reserves became known. China has made more aggressive moves toward the Senkaku Islands since its economic rise. It has implemented the same grey zone operations there as seen elsewhere. In 2010, a Chinese trawler rammed 2 Japanese Coast Guard ships off the islands. The captain was arrested, but after Beijing threatened retaliation, was released by Japanese authorities with no charge. Since then, Chinese ships routinely enter waters close to the islands, and in 2021, China passed a law that permits its Coast Guard to use armed force to defend what Beijing calls its national sovereignty. This measure forces Japan to be more cautious, and resembles moves China made in the South China Sea when it seized control of the Paracel Islands, Scarborough Shoal, and Spratly Islands. Some Chinese policymakers have even been bolder in their territorial claims, with one example being an assertion that Japan has no historical claim to Okinawa. This expansive rhetoric and the grey zone operations all put further pressure on Japan. It's clear that China aims to eventually acquire the Senkakus by forcing Japan to back down in the face of this pressure, just as it did with the Philippines in the Scarborough Shoal in 2012. China's moves in the South China Sea have also been of great concern to Tokyo. Although Japan is far from these waters, the country's future hangs in the balance of the dispute there. Japan is a nation poor in natural resources and must import commodities from abroad to sustain its economy and feed its population. About 40% of the shipping that enters Japan comes through the South China Sea's trade routes. China's military buildup in the South China Sea directly threatens Japan's access to this trade. If China were to secure complete control of the South China Sea, the Japanese economy is at Beijing's mercy. Finally, Japanese policymakers view China's threat to Taiwan as an existential issue for Japan. China's seizure of the island would break the containment of the first island chain, threaten Japanese airspace, and put Japan's maritime trade in an untenable position. Though a secondary threat to China, North Korea also began to menace Japan more in this period. Over the years, the Hermit Kingdom expanded its nuclear arsenal and tested more and more ballistic missiles. These weapons sometimes flew over Japanese waters and airspace. With China's increasing ambitions to change the status quo of the region through military force, and North Korea's continued nuclear and ballistic missile buildup, Japan began to slowly but surely emerge from its pacifistic slumber through the 2010s. The leader primarily responsible for this shift in posture was Shinzo Abe, whose second tenure as Japan's prime minister from 2012 to 2020 was the longest in the country's history. Abe, who had controversial opinions about Japan's conduct in World War II, signaled his intentions about the country's military as early as his first premiership. In 2007, he upgraded the administrative agency of Japan's self-defense forces to full ministerial status, creating the Ministry of Defense. He was also the driving force behind the creation of the quadrilateral security dialogue between Japan, the United States, Australia, and India that year. In his second premiership, he had much more time to implement his policies. As early as 2007, while on a trip to India, Abe hinted at the concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific, FOIP, a strategy which he formally codified in 2016, the year before it made its way into the United States' national security strategy. In 2014, Abe circumvented the difficulty of passing an amendment to Japan's constitution and issued a cabinet decision that upheld the country's legal ability to engage in collective self-defense. This concept was one which permitted Japan to use force to aid and protect its allies in an armed conflict. The United States welcomed this move, but it was controversial domestically, with many Japanese opposition leaders and activists claiming that the reinterpretation would open room for Japan to be dragged into America's conflicts. Abe continued with the reforms despite the public pressure. In 2015, he pushed legislation through the Japanese parliament that permitted the JSDF to engage in overseas combat missions. So Japan had been expanding and reorganizing its military for many years before February 2022, even if the overall level of defense spending remained modest despite all the talk. However, Russia's invasion of Ukraine created a greater sense of urgency in Tokyo. To the Japanese leadership, the invasion proved that aggression on the part of belligerent expansionist powers was not a thing of the past. Japan's relations with Russia have not always been the friendliest either, as the two countries have disputed control of the southernmost Kuril Islands north of Hokkaido, the most northerly of Japan's 4 main islands. More importantly, however, is Russia's close relationship with China. If Russia could invade Ukraine despite the international blowback and sanctions, there was no longer a guarantee that its strategic partner China's rhetoric towards the Senkaku Islands and Taiwan would only remain rhetoric. Therefore, Japan would need to rebuild its military to prepare itself for conflict. As of 2022, the JSDF had about 250,000 active personnel and roughly 56,000 reservists. Although this number seems large, it's small in comparison to Japan's population and compared to its regional neighbors. For example, China has 2 million active military personnel and an additional 1.5 million reservists. North Korea has a 1.2 million man active military with about 600,000 reservists. Even South Korea, which has only about half the population of Japan, has a bigger military, at 555,000 active personnel. Japan's land army is also comparatively deficient in firepower. Although its Type 10 main battle tank, introduced in 2012, is one of the world's most advanced, Japan has few of them at its disposal. Japan is also comparatively lacking in artillery. Instead, the lion's share of the JSDF's land forces consists of defensive systems. However, even before 2022, Japan was increasing the capabilities of its amphibious rapid deployment brigades. These units are designed and equipped to rapidly project force onto the many outlying islands in Japanese territory. These brigades, which often do cross-training with the United States Marine Corps, have 52 AAV-7 amphibious vehicles, V-22 Osprey aircraft, and light armored vehicles to accomplish their mission. Their purpose is obvious: prepare for a potential encounter with China over the Senkakus, and possibly assist in repelling an amphibious assault on Taiwan. Japan's air self-defense force is in comparatively better shape than its army. Japan has the world's 6th largest air force by number of total military aircraft. Of these, Japan has about 25 F-35s in service. The bulk of its combat aircraft consists of the F-15J and the F-2A, a Japanese variant of the F-16. Japan's air force also has a plethora of critical support aircraft like the AWACS. However, even these assets are designed with a home defense mission in mind. Japan lacks long-range missiles and tankers, meaning that its air force cannot project power far beyond the Japanese homeland. Japan's maritime self-defense force is probably the most capable of the 3 branches. The Japanese Navy has 102 units in its fleet, which is smaller than peer countries. Crucially though, Japan has 10,000 trained naval aviators, an area that China is lagging far behind in. Also, 8 of Japan's destroyers are equipped with the American Aegis combat system, which gives the country a premier capability to counter air threats like North Korean ballistic missiles. Japan technically has no aircraft carriers, but its Izumo and Kaga helicopter-carrying destroyers can support the F-35B, the short takeoff and vertical landing variant of the F-35. Japan has conveniently ordered 42 of these aircraft. So the overall verdict on the JSDF is that it's a capable fighting force when fulfilling its specialized function of defending the Japanese home islands, but lacks long-range combat power. The newest build-up intends to make up for that deficiency. Japan's stated mission goals for the build-up are, first, to position the JSDF to take the lead role in defeating an invasion of Japan by 2027. In other words, Japan will no longer rely on the United States to repel an attack on any part of its homeland, including the outlying islands. Beyond that, within 10 years, The JSDF must take the lead in defeating an attempted invasion of Japan earlier and further away, to prevent the threat from reaching the Japanese homeland at all. The objective means that the JSDF just got a much longer range mission than it has traditionally had. With these demands in mind, Japan is now seeking new equipment. For starters, Japan will begin introducing missiles that have a range over 1,000 kilometers. These missiles will include modern American Tomahawk missiles capable of hitting moving targets at sea. Japan's initial order is for 1,500 of these, with the first 400 arriving by 2026. As part of its build-up, Tokyo also plans to produce a domestic missile capable of hitting targets between 2,000 and 3,000 kilometers away. The greater range will allow Japan to attack targets on the East Asian mainland. China and North Korea are the obvious targets for such missiles, but Russia will be put on notice too. The new missiles will mean that any attack on or threat to Japan will come at increased cost to its potential adversaries, regardless of what the United States decides to do. Japan has also entered the hypersonic missile race with its hypervelocity gliding projectile, HVGP. This weapon, first revealed in 2020, will use a solid-fueled rocket to lift the warhead to a high altitude. The warhead will then detach from the rocket and glide to its target at hypersonic velocities. It will be maneuverable, although it would not come with its own power source. Japan intends to have the land version of the HVGP in service before 2030. The arrival of more F-35s of both the A and B variant will also help Japan to reduce the potential that it will lose out in the air. Although Japan's fleet of F-15J and F-2A fighters gives it a formidable presence, this is not as formidable as it once was, with China on track to have as many as 1,000 fifth-generation Chengdu J-20 fighters in service by 2030 under current production rates. The F-35B in particular will increase Japan's range, as its ability to be used on the Izumo and Kaga give Japan its first aircraft carriers since World War II, even though those vessels are not officially designated as such for legal reasons. Japan is also building a sixth-generation fighter, the Mitsubishi FX. Japan's effort is partly linked with the United Kingdom and Italy as part of the Global Air Combat Program. The announcement of Japan's participation in this international effort came in December 2022, the same month Japan said it would increase its defense spending to 2% of GDP by 2027. Unsurprisingly, new air defense capabilities are also a high item on Tokyo's agenda. Japan is set to triple the number of units with anti-ballistic missile capabilities, China's huge arsenal of ballistic missiles, and North Korea's increasing missile threat mandate the change. Japan is also set to build 2 ships with a dedicated anti-ballistic missile purpose. Drones and anti-drone weapons are also a big part of Japan's armament list, and reveals the biggest influence of the Ukraine experience into its thinking. Tokyo is investing in direct energy weapons like lasers and microwaves to shoot down enemy drones. Japan is also researching labor-saving drones like unmanned ground vehicles and even drone ships. One example highlighted in Jane's shows a drone mothership commanding smaller drone ships in a mine-detecting mission. It's notable that Japan's military buildup is not as focused on personnel as similar programs in other countries. Poland, for example, plans to nearly double its military personnel to 300,000 by 2030. There are few such plans in Japan, as Tokyo's policymakers understand they will have difficulty meeting recruiting targets and have an aging population to work with. Japan's buildup is therefore focusing on acquiring capital to substitute for manpower, but there is one notable exception. The JSDF intends to expand its cybernetic warfare-related personnel to 20,000 by 2027. The importance of signals and electronic warfare in Ukraine has clearly made an impact on policymakers in Tokyo. Finally, to support its new emphasis on the SDF fighting further afield, Japan is investing in its military's logistics. Japan intends to build more tankers to refuel its planes away from home bases. There will also be more helicopters and transport planes. To support its build-up, Japan will stockpile more ammunition. The experience of both sides in Ukraine has revealed how rapidly ammunition can become depleted in a modern conflict. Japan intends to stockpile ammunition and build the infrastructure it needs to maintain those stockpiles. In late 2023, Japan began to test its new self-defense strategy. On October 30th, the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force announced it would forward deploy F-35, F-15 and F-2 fighters to bases in Australia and increase joint training with its Australian counterpart. The deployment will be rotational, lasting several months each year. Although the number of deployed planes and pilots remains small for now, it's a significant change in Japan's military posture and will give Japanese officers and service members valuable experience with long-duration missions abroad, a preview of things to come. Although obstacles remain with the rearmament program, the Japanese public is slowly coming on board to the idea. The rise of an increasingly aggressive China, the threat posed by North Korea, and especially Russia's invasion of Ukraine, opened new eyes in the Japanese homeland. With this new determination and Japan's manufacturing prowess, it has the ingredients it needs to become a military power again, and truthfully, has little other choice but to do so. Japan is facing the most difficult security environment it's seen since World War II. China's rise has disrupted the traditional balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region. For Japan, so long reliant on the United States for its defense, the situation is no longer tolerable, especially with America's chaotic internal politics that could wind up throwing its traditional forward presence out of whack. As Japan has territorial disputes with China and is dependent on the shipping lanes that its rival increasingly controls, it no longer has the luxury of pacifism. Therefore, Tokyo is at last set to shake off its decades of strategic inactivity and build a world-class military, capable of deterrence and, if need be, operations far further afield than its homeland. At least if everything goes according to plan. But will it? What do you think about Japan's military buildup? Will it prove to be just hype, as the world has often seen from Germany, or will Japan soon become a much-needed reinforcement for the increasingly stretched United States Indo-Pacific Command? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. It's widely believed that a full-scale Chinese invasion of Taiwan is just a matter of time. Some military experts see this invasion happening soon, in fact next year, 2025, as that's how long they predict it will take China to get ready. Others place the date during the 2030s, as this is when the US may become less dependent on Taiwan's semiconductors and thus potentially abandon its protégé. The third group seems to think that the year 2049, the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, could be the perfect opportunity to take action on the One China policy. But what if we told you that China won't invade Taiwan in 2025, 2030, or 2039, or ever for that matter? That's right. The incessant barrage of warnings about Taiwan's precarious future might sound alarming, but it doesn't always align with the complexities of real-world decision-making. In fact, these warnings overlook key factors that will deter China from launching a full-scale invasion. What are these factors, you might ask? Stick around and that's precisely what you'll find out. But we can't just jump straight into these factors without first understanding the broader context of the Taiwan-China relationship and the complexities involved. So let's take a step back and consider the historical and economic factors that play into this dynamic before delving into the specific reasons why a Chinese invasion of Taiwan may not be as imminent as some fear. Taiwan started out as an ancestral home to the Taiwanese indigenous people, who settled on the island some 6,000 years ago. However, in the 17th century, China annexed this island during the Qing dynasty. Taiwan stayed under Chinese rule until 1895, when it was ceded to the Empire of Japan after China suffered a devastating defeat at the hands of the Japanese military. If World War II had never happened, Taiwan would likely still be under Japanese control. Unfortunately, this war did happen, and the island was handed back to China in 1945, this time for good. Or was it? Just a few short years later, in 1949, the brutal Chinese Civil War ended in the defeat of the nationalist government, led by General Chiang Kai-shek, by the Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong. As a result, the nationalist government fled to Taiwan to avoid persecution and, let's face it, execution. Once in the clear, the exiled government continued to claim sovereignty from China, including the mainland. Mainland China, on the other hand, considered Taiwan to be part of its territory that needed to be reunified with the mainland by force if necessary. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Interestingly, the rest of the world backed Taiwan at first, or the Republic of China to be precise. This mostly had to do with Mao's ruthless rule, which turned China into somewhat of an outcast on the global stage. However, this support didn't last long. In 1971, the United Nations cut diplomatic ties with Taiwan, taking away its official seat at the UN Security Council. This seat was, in turn, given to Mao's PRC as the sole representative of China. Unsurprisingly, others followed suit, switching their diplomatic recognition from the ROC to the PRC. This trend has become so massive that today only a dozen or so countries recognize Taiwan as a sovereign state. However, this diplomatic isolation didn't diminish Taiwan's determination to assert its sovereignty, and that's precisely what it did for the most part, enjoying de facto independence and developing into a prosperous and democratic society. Today, as many as 67% of this society sees itself as Taiwanese, a record high number. Another 28% see themselves as both Taiwanese and Chinese, while only a paltry 3% identify as primarily Chinese. But how Taiwan and its people see themselves was never the issue. Mainland China's assertions were. Though to be fair, even mainland China agreed to a peaceful period following the economic boom of the 1980s. However, this period would abruptly end in 2016 when Taiwan elected its first female president, Tsai Ing-wen. Unlike the previous administration, Tsai and her Democratic Progressive Party, DPP, had no interest in adhering to the One China principle. This departure from the status quo led to increased tensions between Taiwan and mainland China, with Beijing viewing Tsai's presidency as a challenge to its sovereignty claims over Taiwan. So since 2016, the situation between mainland China and Taiwan has been tense, with no resolution. Each new incident just seems to add fuel to the fire, escalating the conflict to new heights of hostility and brinksmanship. So far, the hottest that this fire has gotten was in August 2022, when the US House of Representatives Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan. This move made the PRC seemingly lose all of its cool, if it ever had any restraint, and sent its military to perform a series of live-fire drills that lasted for nearly a week. During these drills, the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, fired at least 11 ballistic missiles in Taiwan's direction. It also sent over 200 military aircraft and over 50 warships to menace the island. But that's not all. Dozens of these military aircraft crossed the median line in the Taiwan Strait, which is considered the unofficial sea border between Taiwan and China. This meant that the PRC came closer to Taiwan than it ever had before, transforming a 12 nautical mile zone around Taiwan into a full-on war zone. A similar, though slightly less dramatic reaction took place in 2023 after Pelosi's successor, Kevin McCarthy, hosted Taiwan's president in California. This time, the PRC sent 14 warplanes and 3 warships to the vicinity of Taiwan, simulating an attack and a blockade of the island. But why stop at simulating these actions? Why not simply continue full steam ahead and invade Taiwan? Mainland China's apparent reluctance to engage in a direct military confrontation with Taiwan can be attributed to a variety of factors, including economic, military, and logistical ones. These factors are also the reasons we believe China won't ever invade Taiwan. So let's break them down. First up, the economic reasons. Typically, economic interests are among the leading reasons for an invasion, as the invading country seeks to gain access to new markets, resources, trade routes, and labor force. Let's not sugarcoat it. China would immensely benefit from such access, as the country is still struggling to recover following the COVID-19 pandemic, with its gross domestic product (GDP) growth rate falling under 5% in 2024. But in reality, China's invasion of Taiwan would bring the nation significantly more harm than good in this department. Let's explain. You see, Taiwan is a major technological power, dominating the global market of semiconductors. Over 60% of all global semiconductors are produced on the almost 14,000 square miles of territory that is Taiwan. Even more impressive, this figure climbs to over 90% when discussing the most advanced semiconductors used in cutting-edge technologies like artificial intelligence, 5G networks, and electric vehicles. Though China also produces these highly valuable resources, its manufacturing capabilities are nowhere near Taiwan's. That's why China is one of Taiwan's biggest semiconductor importers. Not only that, but semiconductors are also China's biggest import overall, narrowly surpassing crude oil. In 2023, the country imported almost $350 billion worth of semiconductors, while importing almost $340 billion worth of crude oil. This means that China would take a massive hit if Taiwan's microchip exports were to halt, and this is precisely what would happen in the case of an invasion. Some experts even believe that Taiwan would deliberately destroy its manufacturing facilities if invaded to prevent China from seizing control of them. If this were to happen, the effects on the global industries would be nothing short of catastrophic. According to a US Department of Defense study, taking Taiwan out of the semiconductor equation means wiping $2.5 trillion from the global GDP over the course of a year. The result? One of the worst economic crises in modern history. And let's not forget, China's most advanced weapons rely on microchips. The PLA will hardly be able to fly its high-tech drones and missiles without a stable supply of Taiwanese semiconductors. Now, you might wonder, could China simply amp up its semiconductor production and replace Taiwan's output? In theory, it could. After all, China has made significant strides in this area, decreasing its dependency on Taiwan by almost 11% from 2022 to 23. However, this endeavor would take an immense amount of effort for years, if not decades, and billions of dollars. And China can't afford to waste any of these resources. But let's say China finds a way to either replace Taiwan's semiconductor output or seize the country's reserves. Would this mean an invasion is inevitable? Absolutely not. After all, we've only gone over the economic reasons preventing a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Now it's time for the military ones. For some background information, China is considered the third strongest military power in the world, according to the Global Firepower Index. Taiwan is number 24. So how could there possibly be military reasons stopping China from invading Taiwan? There absolutely could be when the number one military force in the world stands in your way. That's right, the US's involvement in East Asia is arguably the strongest deterrent to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And the US's protection of Taiwan isn't something that's just implied or assumed. It's backed by the Taiwan Relations Act and the Taiwan Enhanced Resilience Act, which mandate the US to provide Taiwan with the means to defend itself in the case of an invasion. But to make matters worse for China, the US isn't waiting for the worst-case scenario to happen to start arming Taiwan. In 2023, shortly after the PLA's theatrics in the South China Sea, the US State Department approved the first-ever military aid package to Taiwan worth up to $345 million. Best of all, this package is just the beginning. Under the Taiwan Enhanced Resilience Act, the US government is authorized to spend up to $2 billion on Taiwan's military grant assistance each year from 2023 to 27. Talk about a military buildup. Of course, these moves come as a direct response to China's record-high military buildup in the region, which could allow the country to launch a full-scale invasion of Taiwan. But military equipment isn't all that the US is providing to Taiwan. This military superpower is also stationing troops all over and around the island. Out of the top 3 countries with the highest number of active-duty US troops overseas, 2 are in the vicinity of Taiwan: Japan and South Korea. With over 53,000 troops, Japan has the highest concentration of active-duty US forces overseas. South Korea is in third place, with over 24,000 troops. Other notable locations in the region include Guam and Singapore. These figures mean only one thing: if an invasion was to take place, the US could reinforce Taiwan virtually overnight. This brings us to the other countries that might be prepared to counter a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. However, most of these countries wouldn't act solely as US allies, not when some of them have also been wronged by China on multiple occasions. Take Japan as an example. The country has a complex relationship with China, packed with historical grievances and territorial disputes, so much so that China has repeatedly been labeled as the greatest strategic challenge for Japan. The challenges posed by China's growing military might in the Pacific have also prompted Japan to abandon decades of pacifism and boost its military capabilities, and what a boost it's been. In 2023 alone, Japan unveiled a plan to invest a staggering $320 billion into its military equipment. With this 5-year plan, once unthinkable in this pacifist nation, Japan will shoot right to the top of the list of the biggest military spenders in the world. Japan is also an instrumental actor in the so-called First Island chain, much of which is situated in waters claimed by China. But why does this chain matter in a potential China versus Taiwan battle? Because the chain, stretching from Japan to the Philippines, acts as a natural barrier that could impede China's naval access to the Pacific Ocean and, in turn, Taiwan. Better yet, most of the countries in the First Island chain have a vested interest in preventing Taiwan's invasion, so they're sure to take full advantage of this strategic position. But what other countries are we talking about? Primarily the Philippines. Like Japan, this country has had its fair share of geopolitical tensions with China, particularly regarding territorial claims in the South China Sea. So it's no wonder the Philippines has strengthened its defense ties with the US, allowing this country to store its military supplies in Philippine bases. At the moment, the US has access to 9 of these bases, most of which are positioned in the north, allowing it to continue the First Island chain further down the South China Sea. However, the First Island chain isn't the only deterrent to China in the South China Sea. So are Australia's nuclear-powered attack submarines, or they will be soon. Australia is purchasing these submarines from the US and the UK under the AUKUS security partnership between the 3 countries. Officially, Australia is getting these submarines to strengthen its naval fleet. Unofficially, it's to deter any Chinese move against Taiwan. And what a deterrence these submarines can be! Australia is getting between 3 and 5 Virginia-class attack submarines, the US Navy's newest undersea warfare capability. These submarines are designed to seek and destroy both enemy submarines and surface vessels. Two factors make them a particularly powerful deterrence against China. One, they're exceptionally difficult to track and eliminate, and two, they can be equipped with nuclear warheads. Better yet, these Virginia-class attack submarines are just the beginning. Australia is actually working on producing a new class of submarines, the SSN-AUKUS class, which will send a clear message to any potential aggressor. Australia is serious about defending and maintaining peace and stability in the region. However, it's also important to note that Australia has never officially promised to help the US defend Taiwan. Moreover, some experts believe that there are no 100% guarantees that any of the mentioned nations would commit to sending troops and military equipment to defend Taiwan. So does this mean China could have a clear path to invasion after all? Not quite. Even if Taiwan was standing all alone against China, this invasion would still be a formidable challenge for the aggressor. But why? Due to many military and logistical impediments. Military-wise, China hasn't fought a war in decades. Interestingly, the country's last war effort was another invasion, or an attempt at an invasion to be precise. The so-called Sino-Vietnamese War lasted for about a month and concluded with China withdrawing its troops in March 1979. This means that China hasn't tested out its military readiness in a large-scale conflict for quite a while. Taiwan, on the other hand, has been preparing for the possibility of this conflict virtually its entire existence. This brings us to another often overlooked deterrence factor, Taiwan's strength. Even if China had no internal military issues, invading Taiwan certainly wouldn't be a walk in the park. Despite its relatively small size, Taiwan has maintained a well-trained and, thanks to the US, well-equipped military, laser-focused on defending its territory against a potential invasion. And Taiwan isn't showing any signs of slowing down. In 2023 alone, it ordered $1.8 billion in equipment and weapons from the US. Here's a brief breakdown of what that amount of money brought in. $619 million worth of modern air warfare missiles, $500 million worth of F-16 infrared search and track systems, $332 million worth of ammunition and technical assistance, $300 million worth of services under command, control, communications and computers C4 life support cycle, $108 million worth of spares and repair parts for weapons and wheeled vehicles. As you can tell, Taiwan isn't playing any games, and its military budget is only expected to rise. But let's say China chooses to disregard all of this and proceed with the invasion. After all, China is still immensely more powerful than Taiwan in the military department. Its military would surely guarantee a victory. Not quite. Taiwan is defended by another powerful factor, its geography. It seems that even Mother Nature is Taiwan's ally. Let's go over all the factors that make a potential invasion of Taiwan nothing short of a logistical nightmare. First things first, this invasion would have to be a primarily amphibious assault, since Taiwan is an island. These types of assault are already more complex than traditional land invasions due to the need for specialized equipment and exceptional coordination. In fact, a single missing element is enough to botch the entire operation. Unfortunately for China, it's quite easy to mess things up when you're looking at a collection of over 100 islands to account for and secure. Plus, let's not forget that most of these islands are heavily armed with artillery and covered in impregnable military defense posts. And that's just the islands. To get to them, China would have to cross the incredibly choppy Taiwan Strait, the 100-mile-wide stretch of water separating the two countries. To make matters worse, the country's military could only do so during specific periods of the year, as two monsoon seasons, high tidal waves, typhoons, and other extreme weather events don't leave much of a window. But it's not like China can decide overnight to take advantage of fair weather. After all, it would have to transport hundreds of thousands of soldiers across the Taiwan Strait first. Sure, Taiwan might have a little over 200,000 active duty personnel, but it would take China at least 4 to 5 times more personnel to secure a seamless victory. This operation would likely have to be even larger than the D-Day operation of World War II, the largest amphibious invasion in military history. The D-Day operation involved 7,000 vessels and almost 200,000 troops crossing the 100-mile English Channel. It took over 3 weeks for all of the 850,000 troops to land on the beaches of Normandy to liberate France. With China's invasion of Taiwan, we're potentially talking about 1 million soldiers crossing the Taiwan Strait, and China has nowhere near the number of ships necessary to pull this endeavor off. Even if Beijing were to turn to merchant and other civilian ships, things wouldn't get much better. After all, these ships are more vulnerable and take significantly longer to unload. All this ruckus would give Taiwan plenty of time to erect barriers, target the incoming ships, and secure the potential landing site with massive amounts of troops. Speaking of the landing sites, China wouldn't have much luck there either. Taiwan only has a few deep-water ports and beaches that could accommodate a large landing force. Other landing sites feature incredibly shallow water that would require China to anchor its ships far away and gradually transport the equipment and troops to the shores. Whichever of these two scenarios Chinese vessels choose, the results will be the same. Taiwanese troops, artillery, and missiles will be waiting for them. But let's give China the benefit of the doubt and say it manages to overcome this obstacle as well. After struggling to establish a beachhead in Taiwan, China would face another powerful enemy, the island's mountainous terrain. Virtually the entire coastal shoreline of eastern Taiwan is covered in mountains, with some peaks reaching over 12,000 feet. If China wants to secure these wild regions, it would likely have to engage in guerrilla warfare with Taiwanese troops, who are very familiar with the terrain, and they know precisely how to defend it. Even if the Chinese troops somehow manage to survive these treacherous woods and mountains, it wouldn't be the end of their struggles. From guerrilla warfare, they would quickly have to transition into urban warfare to take Taipei. After all, the only way to seize full control over the island is to capture its capital. Unsurprisingly, this task would also be nearly impossible. There are only a few routes leading into Taipei, and the Taiwanese military would likely destroy them to prevent a rapid Chinese advance. The Chinese troops that do manage to make it through are looking at incredibly slow street-by-street fighting that would turn this invasion into a prolonged and bloody conflict. This challenging, expensive, and uncertain invasion sounds awfully familiar, doesn't it? This leads us to arguably the biggest reason why China won't invade Taiwan: Russia's fiasco in Ukraine. Do you see the parallels? One of the most powerful countries in the world goes against a much smaller neighbor and expects a clear victory. Yet it's met with fierce resistance and bogged down in a protracted conflict with significant economic and diplomatic repercussions. And let's be honest, Taiwan has an even better logistical advantage than Ukraine. Sure, they would both have home court advantage, but as you heard in the video, Taiwan's mountainous terrain and densely populated urban areas are seemingly ready to join the resistance. Plus, Taiwan has been preparing for a possible Chinese invasion for what seems like forever, backing these efforts with generations of sophisticated and powerful weapons from the US. That's not to mention all the direct support Taiwan has from the US and potentially other countries like the UK, Germany, Japan, Australia, and the Philippines. Sure, Ukraine received tons of military aid, but no country has openly pledged to defend it like Taiwan. This makes war in Ukraine a cautionary tale for China. The country was able to see firsthand how powerful the US is as an ally. Now imagine how powerful it would be as an adversary. This leads us to a simple conclusion. The Ukrainian scenario and the US military's superiority are holding China back. The country realized that any attempt to invade Taiwan would likely result in a prolonged, costly, and ultimately unsuccessful conflict. Even if China somehow managed to win this ill-conceived war, it would be a Pyrrhic victory. Basically, China is looking at a lose-lose scenario. That's probably why China's President Xi Jinping has taken on a peacekeeping role on the global stage, well, at least officially. In April 2023, he even offered a 12-point peace plan for Ukraine and welcomed French President Emmanuel Macron and European Commission Chairman Ursula von der Leyen to Beijing to discuss the war. Just a few days later, Taiwan's former president Ma Ying-jeou visited mainland China, becoming the first current or former Taiwanese leader to do so since 1949. During his visit, he spoke of the common inheritance of blood, language, history, and culture between China and Taiwan. Trampling all over these diplomatic victories and stumbling into a costly war would be incredibly foolish on Xi's part. But then again, stranger things have happened. So while a Chinese invasion of Taiwan isn't likely to happen, it shouldn't be entirely dismissed as a possibility. Here are just a few factors that could trigger China's decision to invade Taiwan after all. Number 1, a perception of US weakness. The outcome of the war in Ukraine, as well as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, can severely impact how the US is perceived globally. In addition, these conflicts have the potential to strain the country's military arsenal substantially, affecting its ability to respond to other global crises adequately. Number 2, the US-Taiwan relationship. Now, numerous different factors within this relationship can affect China's decision-making. Beijing might decide to launch a full-scale invasion if high-ranking US officials continue visiting Taiwan, or if Taiwan keeps purchasing exorbitant amounts of weapons from the US and perhaps even testing them, or if there's a clear shift in the US's Taiwan policy, such as a formal declaration of support for Taiwanese independence. And number 3, the one factor that has nothing to do with the US, President Xi's health. You see, there are some speculations that China's president might not be in the best health. If these are true, he might want to secure his legacy by finally reunifying China before it's too late. But what do you think? Are any of these reasons enough to trigger an invasion of Taiwan, considering what China is up against? And if you agree that this invasion isn't going to happen, which deterrent do you believe to be the strongest? Share your thoughts, opinions, and theories in the comments section below. Now go and check out China's military disaster, why invasion of Taiwan just became impossible. Or click this other video instead. As tensions rise over the possibility of China making a move on Taiwan, Taipei isn't just sitting back. While the US has promised to back Taiwan's fight to stay independent, including military support, Taiwan knows it's got to stand on its own 2 feet. To keep China at bay, it's clear Taiwan needs to show some muscle. Usually, having nukes would do the trick, but given Taiwan's tricky spot on the world stage, getting into the nuclear game could really rile up Beijing, seeing it as Taiwan trying to cut ties completely. And Beijing would likely take that as a straight-up declaration of war. Though Taiwan runs its own show with its own government and economy, big players like the US still don't officially recognize it as its own country. So from China's point of view, any major move by Taiwan towards independence, especially getting nuclear weapons, would be like declaring war against the People's Republic of China. But Taiwan can't just keep putting up with China's threats forever. It looks like Taiwan's about ready to show Beijing it won't be pushed around anymore. So what's Taiwan's play if things heat up? Let's unpack their strategy and see just how they might swing back if the Red Dragon comes knocking. From unexpected military tactics to audacious defense plans, you won't believe the aces Taiwan has up its sleeve. Let's begin. Without nuclear weapons, Taiwan's military planners were forced to come up with an idea for a single, strategic attack that would, hypothetically, be too devastating for Beijing to ignore. A threat to the Chinese mainland so catastrophic that before China moved forward with any invasion scenario, it would have to be taken into serious consideration. It would be difficult to hit Beijing, even with Taiwan's newest set of supersonic ballistic missiles, and the capital's surface-to-air defenses are simply too strong for a conventional aerial bombardment to do the job. But what about the Three Gorges Dam? Were the Three Gorges Dam to be destroyed, the water contained in its 600-kilometer-long reservoir would cascade into the lower Yangtze River, quickly overwhelming the flood containment lakes located downstream, resulting in immeasurable destruction to the population and industrial centers of Wuhan, Nanjing, and Shanghai. In the resulting flooding, 2/3 of China's rice production would also be lost, a hit that would potentially be felt by some 400 million people. In the event of undeterrable Chinese aggression, Taiwan's unofficial plan to level the Three Gorges Dam would put the threat of mutually assured destruction on the table. What's really scary to think about here is that this gives Taiwan the opportunity to use conventional weapons to create devastation on par with or greater than a nuclear attack. If Taiwan did retaliate against Chinese aggression by taking out the dam, however, this would almost certainly prompt an actual nuclear response from Beijing, whose 500 or so operational nuclear warheads would be more than enough to sink the island into the Pacific. Located in Hubei, the Three Gorges Dam stands 181 meters high and is 2,335 meters long and creates a reservoir that covers 1,000 square kilometers and contains nearly 40 billion cubic meters of water. It's the world's largest hydropower project and supplies electricity to 20 million Chinese citizens, making it an attractive target since its construction began in 1932. In 1939, when Japanese military forces took control of China, believing they would maintain it indefinitely, they implemented their own designs for the prospective dam, calling it the Otani Plan. But after China was liberated by the US after World War II, an engineer from the United States Bureau of Reclamation named John L. Savage picked up the project. More than 50 Chinese engineers traveled to the US to receive advanced training, but due largely to civil unrest, the project never fully got off the ground. It wasn't until 1954, after a series of devastating floods that killed an estimated 33,000 people, that the dam project was revisited. But it would still take until 1992 before the National People's Congress finally approved the plan. Construction started up again on December 14, 1944, and in 2006, the dam began generating power. Currently, it's operating at full capacity. But even if Taiwan did choose to retaliate by blowing up the world's fourth largest dam, a course of action that's been hotly debated in Taiwan since the early 1990s, the question still remains: does the Taiwanese military even have the necessary capabilities to do so? Back in 2018, a strategist with Taiwan's renowned Tamkang University suggested that 2 well-placed ballistic missiles would probably do the job, but the Chinese media was quick to dismiss this as false. The dam, they said, is a steel concrete gravity dam, meaning that the water is contained by the sheer mass of the individual sections. So even if one section was seriously damaged, that doesn't mean the others would be compromised. Due to its immense size, they claimed, it could potentially withstand the impact of a tactical nuclear strike. The state media also pointed out the air defense capabilities of the People's Liberation Army, consisting of large numbers of anti-air and anti-surface missiles, along with its regional missile defense shield, would be more than enough to ward off any attack. More recently, though, during an unusual exchange between a Taiwanese legislator and an official from China's Taiwan Affairs Office, the issue was raised again. The representative from Taiwan said they'd never invade China, nor would they launch an unprovoked attack on Beijing or the Three Gorges Dam. But before China attacks Taiwan, he added, it should keep in mind that Taiwan does possess missiles that can reach as far as Beijing. Unfazed, if not insulted, by the notion, the Chinese official responded, if they dare strike a stone with an egg, it will only accelerate their demise. In the past, even through decades of tension between Taipei and Beijing, Taiwan's politicians have only mentioned the island's capacity to inflict large numbers of civilian casualties by striking the Chinese mainland with reluctance. Well, it appears that times have changed. The Three Gorges Dam sits approximately 1,200 kilometers from Taiwan, making it a challenging target for most of its current conventional systems. A bombing run would almost certainly be met by heavy surface-to-air resistance. The Air Force would simply lose too many aircraft to make the strike effective, which makes a missile attack on the dam the only realistic option. Still, though, China could reduce the devastation of an attack by draining the dam in advance. Preemptive action like this would, however, act as a clear warning to Taipei that Beijing was planning something big. It would also heavily disrupt commerce along the lower Yangtze River. Also, if Taiwan does come out and blatantly threaten the Three Gorges Dam, whether they actually plan to attack it or not, it would likely outrage the Chinese public and encourage them to call for equally destructive measures, given that attacks on civilian water infrastructure are typically considered to be war crimes. The most recent example being Russia's heinous attack on the Kakhovka Dam in Ukraine that caused heavy flooding and killed approximately 250 people. Clearly, in the rare event Taiwan is forced into using some sort of doomsday strategy, the outcome will be bad all round. Which is partly why, in 2023, Taiwan increased its total defense spending. Perhaps recognizing the need to explore other avenues of military deterrence, it allocated a record $19 billion, that's 2.6% of its total GDP. But still, some analysts believe that the island needs to be investing much more in its military. To her credit, former President Tsai Ing-wen reversed years of stagnant military spending, nearly doubling Taiwan's defense budget over the course of her 4-year term. During her tenure, she made the very difficult and controversial decision to extend the length of compulsory military service for men, starting January 2024, from 4 months back up to 1 year. Currently, Taiwan's combined armed forces consist of approximately 215,000 active duty personnel, compared to the more than 2 million troops that makes up the armed forces of the People's Republic of China. Determined to strengthen Taiwan's military capabilities, former President Tsai also put money toward the development of asymmetric weapons, such as missiles and mines, and initiated an overhaul of Taiwan's reserve forces. There's really no question about it. When Tsai vacated the office in early 2024, she left behind a much stronger military than the one she'd inherited. Which is great, because if a hot war does ever break out with China, whose official defense budget is around $224 billion, nearly 12 times the size of Taiwan's, Taiwan is going to need every advantage it can get if it will have any hope of holding the line cutting through the Taiwan Strait. The nearly $250 billion China allocates for defense has allowed it to amass an array of deadly warfighting weapons, ballistic missiles, submarines, and modern air defense units, as well as advanced fighters and long-range bombers stationed on China's east coast and reclaimed land in the South China Sea, well within range of Taiwan. Because of its huge investment and commitment to modernization, the Chinese military, at least on paper, clearly dominates Taiwan's. China has more than 1,900 fighter aircraft to Taiwan's 300, 71 submarines to Taiwan's 2, 45 frigates to Taiwan's 22, and 36 destroyers to Taiwan's 4. In its arsenal, the PLA also has battle-ready nuclear-powered submarines and fifth-generation fighter jets, as well as other cutting-edge capabilities that Taiwan's military simply does not. In fact, in terms of the total number of ships, China currently has the largest navy in the world. Taiwan will likely never be able to match China's military spending dollar for dollar, so it'd be wise to invest as much as they can on deterrence. This means procuring more anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles, investing in rapid mining capabilities, developing drones and unmanned underwater vehicles, expanding defense capabilities, and shoring up critical infrastructure. And perhaps most importantly, expanding and modernizing its arsenal of ballistic missiles. Since it was first developed in the early 2000s, the Sinistester 2E, a surface-to-surface land attack cruise missile developed by Taiwan's National Chongsang Institute of Science and Technology, has been the showpiece of Taiwan's arsenal. Capable of launching from surface ships, submarines, and ground-based launchers, this upgraded version of the Sinistester 2 missile featured improvements to both accuracy and range. But still, the HF-2E, which was developed to serve a similar function as the US Navy's Tomahawk cruise missile, only has a maximum range of around 1,200 kilometers, roughly 200 kilometers short of the Three Gorges Dam. Then came the Yunfeng, a surface-to-surface supersonic cruise missile that Taiwan was initially developing in secret, given that it's one of the few Taiwanese strategic assets designed to reach targets deep in northern and central China. To avoid public scrutiny, test flights for the Yunfeng are rumored to have been concealed within the Sinistester 3 test program, Taiwan's first supersonic anti-ship cruise missile. The standard Yunfeng is believed to have a range of 1,200 kilometers, but an advanced version that's also in development could reach out to as far as 2,000 kilometers. The missile's ramjet engine allows it to travel at supersonic speeds, making it capable of delivering satellites to low Earth orbit or, if traveling at Mach 3, reaching the Three Gorges Dam in about 20 minutes. But before we go too much further down the road that will almost certainly lead to all-out war, it's important to look quickly at how we got here. Back in the mid-20th century, the Communist People's Republic of China, the PRC, and the Old Republic of China, the ROC, ended up fighting a brutal civil war for control of mainland China that lasted until 1949. The war ended when the PRC forced the ROC to retreat to the island nation of Taiwan, which had been annexed China by the Qing dynasty in 1683. Despite strong grassroots support, a superior military, and large arsenal of Japanese weapons assembled from stocks left in Manchuria after Japan's occupation ended in 1945, at the end of the Civil War, the Communists didn't hold any major cities. But years of corruption and mismanagement had eroded public support for the ROC, who as early as 1947 had been looking to Taiwan as a possible point of relocation. And when the ROC did ultimately head for Taiwan, this effectively ended the fighting, but a formal peace treaty to officially end the conflict was never signed, which means technically the Chinese Civil War has been more or less on pause for the past 3/4 of a century, making it one of the modern world's longest-lasting frozen conflicts. And all this time, ever since the ROC was expelled from mainland China, the PRC has claimed to be the sole legitimate government of all of China, of which Taiwan is an inseparable part. This stance is commonly referred to as the One China policy, and in practical terms means that Beijing does not and will not recognize Taiwan as an independent country, but rather a province in rebellion. But this is where things get a little tricky, given that the ROC also officially supports the One China policy, just in reverse. It's like this: the ROC does not deny that Taiwan is a part of China, the only difference is they're claiming that they are the legitimate government, and not the PRC, meaning the Taiwanese government effectively views all of mainland China as a series of its provinces that have been in constant rebellion for the past 75 years. However, the ROC's adherence to the One China policy should be considered primarily as a strategic political maneuver, more theatrical than practical. For in a way, they are compelled to maintain their position as the sole government of all of China, however implausible, because if the ROC were to abandon this claim and simply say, "We are only the government of Taiwan," Beijing could interpret this as a formal declaration of independence, which would likely prompt an immediate military response. But if China feels so strongly about reunification, you might be asking, why has it waited so long to even attempt to take back Taiwan? Well, back in 1972, Chairman Mao Zedong famously told US President Richard Nixon that the PRC could wait 100 years for Taiwan to come back. So for many decades, that's what Beijing did. It waited, hoping that Taiwan would voluntarily decide to reunify with the mainland. But now, half a century later, Taiwan has shown less and less interest in teaming back up. It appears that Beijing has run out of patience. And this has prompted both Taiwan and the United States to prepare themselves for a potential conflict, a conflict that neither side truly wants and no nation would benefit from. For if a war between China and a US-backed Taiwan were to break out, it would profoundly disrupt the world as we know it, causing irreversible damage to the global economy and compromise an untold number of vital international relationships. This is why everyone, especially Taiwan, has been looking for ways to deter China, the most likely candidate to throw the first stone. For their part, Taiwan has adopted 3 overlapping strategies of deterrence. The more diplomatic of the 3, as we discussed before, requires Taipei, at an official level, to stay committed to the One China policy and keep insisting that the ROC is the rightful government of all of China. It's a bit far-fetched, but by sticking with this approach, it leaves China with some hope, a very small amount of hope, that the ROC might one day reverse course and peacefully concede control of Taiwan to Beijing. This, however, is highly unlikely, as over the years Taiwan has developed into an enthusiastic democracy with a political culture that starkly contrasts China's current autocratic system. While it doesn't exactly fit the traditional model of a dictatorship, where power is concentrated in the hands of a single individual, the PRC maintains tight control over the government, military, media, and civil society, which has made the Taiwanese even more determined not to reunify. At the moment, the 2 largest political parties on the island are the old Kuomintang Party, or KMT, which continues to push for Chinese nationalism and peaceful reunification with the mainland, and the Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP, which remains a staunch advocate for Taiwanese nationalism and eventual statehood. The last 3 presidential elections in Taiwan in 2016, 2020, and 2024 have all resulted in DPP victories, essentially crushing Beijing's dream of a diplomatic reunification and the world's hope for a peaceful resolution. For as long as the DPP has been in power, any step Taiwan has taken toward international recognition as a separate state, Beijing has met with increasing hostility. Take, for example, Nancy Pelosi's visit to the island in August of 2022. Her visit wasn't officially sanctioned by the White House, but at the time she was serving as the Speaker of the US House of Representatives, and during a press conference with President Tsai, said that her visit was a sign of the United States' unwavering commitment to supporting Taiwan's democracy. This, unsurprisingly, infuriated Beijing. And within days of Pelosi's departure from the island, Chinese fighter jets tore across the so-called median line running down the middle of the Taiwan Strait. The Chinese Navy patrolled heavily around Taiwan's eastern coast, and a barrage of Chinese ballistic missiles splashed down all around the island, while some even flew directly overhead and crashed into the exclusive economic zone of Japan. These events, which were unprecedented until then, came as a rude awakening for US military planners who'd long thought a full-scale Chinese invasion of Taiwan was impossible. And now, with 4 years of DPP rule ahead, under newly elected President Lai Ching-te, it's hard to say what China might do if intentionally or unintentionally provoked. Given that there's little to no hope of diplomatic reunification, does that leave war as the only option? Hopefully, President Xi Jinping thinks long and hard before crossing that line, because even if the US doesn't officially acknowledge Taiwan's independence and hasn't since 1979, it does have strong unofficial relationships with the island and remains its most fruitful backer and arms supplier. Past comments made by President Joe Biden have also suggested that the US would defend Taiwan if it were attacked. Biden is also planning to dispatch an unofficial delegation to Taipei as a demonstration of its continued support for the DPP and its new president. But still, this doesn't guarantee that the US will intervene on Taiwan's behalf. In 1991, the US jumped to defend Kuwait when Saddam Hussein invaded, but Kuwait had something Taiwan doesn't: oil. A lot of oil. And Washington simply couldn't risk that supply falling into Saddam's hands. Taiwan, on the other hand, lacks significant natural resources that might encourage the US or others to come to its aid. The island possesses virtually no oil, coal, or gas. However, what Taiwan lacks in natural resources, it more than makes up for in technological ingenuity, business savvy, and forward thinking. And this brings us to the second of Taiwan's overlapping deterrence strategies, or what's commonly referred to as its silicon shield. After being invented and developed in the US in the late 1950s and early 60s, silicon microchips only got smaller and more advanced as time went on. Now they are one of the world's most important technological resources, used in computers, smartphones, digital cameras, drones, microwaves, calculators, and air conditioners. They are also essential to cryptocurrency mining and the stock market. Oh, not to mention guided missiles, fighter jets, and a whole range of other military applications related to artificial intelligence. Initially, US companies dominated every aspect of microchip production, from research and development to design, to the invention of the highly specialized tools required for assembly, to the manufacturing process itself. But by the late 1980s, American companies were becoming increasingly frustrated with the ever higher costs of actually building the chips. Coincidentally, it was around this time too that Morris Chang, the undisputed godfather of the microchip industry, returned to Taiwan and, along with the ROC government, came up with an idea. Instead of competing with the US by developing a separate microchip industry and risk antagonizing the US government, why not create a new type of company that focuses solely on the expensive and labor-intensive manufacturing process? For the biggest US microchip companies like Texas Instruments, where Chang had been working the past 25 years, outsourcing this final stage of the process would both lower their overall costs and increase their profit margins. It would also, Chang and the ROC suspected, solidify Taiwan's status as crucial to the still emerging microchip industry. Today, the most advanced microchips, designed by companies like Apple, can only be manufactured within a single building in Taiwan's Hsinchu Science Park, located about 80 kilometers southwest of Taipei. And the company who manufactures them, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company Limited, or simply TSMC, is one of the largest and most valuable companies in the world. 4 of the 9 largest global microchip manufacturers are located in Taiwan, and together they produce nearly 70% of the world's microchips. More importantly though, these 4 companies produce around 90% of the world's most cutting-edge chips that contain billions of microscopic transistors, some that are 5 nanometers or smaller, about the width of a strand of human DNA. And it's the protection of this industry that makes Taiwan's continued security absolutely vital to just about every country in the world. And how vital? Well, in a study commissioned by the US Department of Defense, researchers determined that any serious disruption of Taiwan's microchip industry would result in an estimated $2.5 trillion in losses per year to the worldwide economy. That's more than the economies of Ukraine and Russia combined. Were this industry to be seriously compromised, it would likely trigger a worldwide financial meltdown. Global production of smartphones would be cut in half at least, while the manufacture of just about everything, computers, cars, missiles, etc., would slow to a crawl. Many of the biggest US companies from Apple to General Motors would struggle to produce anything at all. If China were to cut off the world's primary supply of microchips, either intentionally or inadvertently, there's no telling what downstream effect this would have on the untold number of companies, governments, and individuals that rely on them. The ripple effects of this would also reach militaries across the globe that depend on microchips for, among a whole range of other things, missile guidance systems and emerging artificial intelligence capabilities. So yeah, Taiwan is important to not just the US, but the rest of the world as well, including China. And it's this critical level of economic importance provided by Taiwan's massive microchip industry that not only creates an incentive for the US to ensure the island's safety, but will also hopefully deter China from doing anything that might disrupt an industry that it relies on as much as anyone else. China, despite having invested billions of dollars into developing their own microchip industry, still can't compete with Taiwan, which means that even if China were somehow able to seize the island without damaging its chip foundries, there's no guarantee that they will be able to run them. Taiwan's microchip industry relies on a complex supply chain that includes tens of thousands of experienced workers, as well as designs and equipment that come from the US, Japan, and the Netherlands. And in the event of an invasion, it's likely that these supply chains would be immediately cut off, leaving China to figure out how to restart operations on their own, which would likely be a daunting, if not impossible task. Therefore, economically speaking, it would be a huge mistake for China to invade Taiwan, at least until it becomes more self-sufficient when it comes to manufacturing these highly complex chips, making Taiwan's silicon shield perhaps its best defense. But are these economic and diplomatic incentives enough to hold off a Chinese invasion? What if Taiwan were to formally declare independence? And what happens if the US continues to elevate its own chip manufacturing capabilities? Could this undermine Washington's economic incentive to defend Taiwan? It's hard to say. But it's because of lingering questions like these that Taiwan has had to come up with a third deterrence option, the one we've already discussed, the hypothetical destruction of the Three Gorges Dam. Hypothetically, if Taiwan was able to stockpile enough supersonic ballistic missiles to bring down the dam, which could be thousands, given that the dam is essentially a mountain of concrete, this would result in one of the largest and most horrific floods in human history. The lower Yangtze Valley would be completely submerged under an apocalyptic amount of water, the cities of Wuhan, Nanjing, and Shanghai would be mostly washed away. And as we said before, along with catastrophic economic damage, millions, if not tens of millions, of civilians would likely be killed. But an attack on the dam might not even be necessary to trigger this disaster. Way back in 2008, Chinese officials acknowledged that the Three Gorges Reservoir might be triggering landslides, altering the local ecosystem, and causing a whole range of other serious environmental problems. For years leading up to the dam's construction, geologists, biologists, and environmentalists warned that building such a massive hydropower dam in such a heavily populated area would threaten millions of lives, as well as an untold number of plant and animal species. These warnings came long before the government ordered some 1.2 million people that had been living in towns and villages along the banks of the Yangtze River to leave. And even after, Chinese and foreign scientists warned that the area's remaining residents would be in danger, and they were right. Only a month after the reservoir began being filled, in June 2003, around 20 million cubic meters of rock slid into the Qingjiang River, just 3 kilometers from where it flows into the Yangtze, creating 20-meter-high waves that killed at least 14 people. But still the water levels were raised, and in November 2007, the ground gave out again, and over 3,000 cubic meters of earth and rock tumbled onto a highway near the entrance to a railway tunnel in Badong County, burying a bus and killing at least 30 people. Tinkering with the reservoir's water level over the years is also believed to have caused a series of localized earthquakes, as the dam was built on a pair of major fault lines, the Jiuangxi and the Zigui Badong. For now though, the dam is still absolutely fundamental to China's industrial, commercial, and residential sectors, as it provides electricity to around 20 million people. This means too that an attack on the dam would almost certainly trigger a retaliatory nuclear strike from Beijing. Which means even in retaliation, Taiwan would probably never utilize this option. So the ROC must simply hope that knowing they could do it will dissuade China from ever attempting an invasion. It's certainly possible too that a more conventional strategy of military deterrence will be enough to make Beijing think twice before sending its troops across the Taiwan Strait. In recent years, Taiwan has transformed itself into a hard target with a formidable defense, leaning heavily on what military planners call the porcupine strategy that was first introduced in 2017 by the former chief of Taiwanese military, Lee Si-ming, but has evolved via a range of lessons learned in Ukraine. This strategy is based on the effectiveness of asymmetrical warfare, mines, mobile missile systems, and drones to impede and demoralize an invading force. While the porcupine analogy stems from the animal's natural defensive capabilities, its thousands of individual barbed quills sticking out in every direction, in a military sense, this is what the mountainous islands of Taiwan look like now, except its quills are primarily mobile anti-aircraft, anti-tank, and anti-ship weapons. Taiwan's military leaders are also well aware that a Chinese invasion would be the largest amphibious invasion since 1944, when the Allies landed in Normandy on D-Day. To be successful, China would need to assemble between 300,000 to as many as 1 million troops, plus equipment, and it would take an armada of hundreds of transport ships concentrated on the western side of the Taiwan Strait to deploy them. And there's just no way China could assemble such a massive force without drawing the attention of US surveillance satellites. Washington would undoubtedly pass this information on to the Taiwanese military, giving them time to ramp up their countermeasures and strengthen their defenses even more. Just as the US warned Ukraine of imminent Russian aggression, for months leading up to the actual invasion, American intelligence agencies would almost certainly do the same for Taiwan. This scenario, however, would be far more challenging than Russia's attack on Ukraine. Before invading, Russia was able to amass a huge number of troops, as well as tanks, artillery, fuel, and ammunition, along thousands of kilometers of Ukraine's borders. Taiwan, on the other hand, is separated from the Chinese mainland by the Taiwan Strait, about 130 kilometers of open ocean. En route, China's fleet would be highly vulnerable to Taiwanese missiles and aerial assaults. Getting across the strait, though, through waters that are typically rough most of the year, would probably be the least of their problems. With mostly rugged terrain and limited beaches, Taiwan's coastline is not ideal at all for a massive amphibious landing. Not to mention, all of the 14 possible beachheads where Chinese troops could land have already been extensively fortified. Any assaulting force could expect to face heavy artillery, missile attacks, and machine gun fire upon arrival. It's also believed that at least some of the beaches are equipped with a series of underwater pipelines designed to pump flammable liquid into the shallows and torch landing troops. Clearly, the sort of invasion that would be necessary to take Taiwan would not be a walk in the park for China. But depending on how desperate Beijing gets, conventional military deterrence might not be enough. Even so, Taiwan still has their diplomatic strategy and silicon shield to fall back on. And if nothing else works and Chinese troops are storming toward Taipei, they will still have one card left to play, the Three Gorges Dam. To actually arrive at this doomsday scenario, though, where mutually assured destruction is the only option left, Taiwan would not only need to be abandoned by its allies, but all of its other potential deterrents would have to have clearly failed. But what do you think? Are economic and diplomatic incentives enough to hold off a Chinese invasion? Will Taiwan's porcupine strategy or silicon shield keep Chinese troops from landing on its shores? What if Taiwan were to formally declare independence? Even in retaliation, would an attack on the Three Gorges Dam be justifiable? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Now go and check out Taiwan's strategy to counter Chinese invasion, or click this other video instead. Last year, China's military leadership underwent seismic shifts, leading many on the world stage to wonder if there are deep-rooted issues plaguing the nation's defense forces. Some of these questions were fueled by widespread corruption allegations, over a dozen senior staff officers being let go from their high-ranking positions, and even some suspicious unexplained deaths among the top brass. But while many nations were recently growing concerned over President Xi Jinping's aspirations for invading Taiwan, a bombshell report from Bloomberg has many rethinking China's capability of taking over the populated island. The new details released at the beginning of this year claims Chinese intercontinental ballistic missiles (ICBMs) are inoperable, with some allegedly being filled with water instead of propellant. Could these concerns about China's nuclear deterrent readiness be what's been causing trouble for high-ranking officials? Or would this unprecedented purge of China's military be a symptom of the inadequate system? Before examining these latest remarkable claims in detail, let's first learn more about the Chinese People's Liberation Army and what's become known as China's nuclear deterrent triad. The People's Liberation Army, or PLA, is the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party and the military force of the People's Republic of China, with over 2,035,000 active personnel split among 5 service branches: the Ground Force, Navy, Air Force, Rocket Force, and Strategic Support Force. China's military is the largest in the world. But it's been described as massive but sluggish by experts. Sheer size can't compensate for technological advancements, as we've seen recently with the Russo-Ukrainian conflict. The People's Liberation Army Rocket Force, PLARF, is the main strategic missile force of the PLA and consists of at least 120,000 personnel. The ARF branch is arguably Xi's favorite, considering the amount of money and manpower put into the branch. It's responsible for controlling nuclear and conventional strategic missiles, and intelligence says it's rapidly expanding. This has caught the eye of many global leaders on the world stage because the ARF ballistic anti-ship missiles are the foundation for China's advanced nuclear counterattack capabilities and their anti-access area denial, or A2AD, system. China is attempting to modernize. How is it faring? United States policymakers and intelligence officials alike have all been historically frustrated and surprised by announcements coming from President Xi and his inner circle. One of the more recent announcements, that Xi has devoted billions of dollars to his aim of transforming the military into a modern force, is among one of many new surprises. One report notes that Xi has specifically pumped billions into buying and developing equipment to build this world-class military by 2050, with Beijing's defense budget growing faster than its economic capacity. With rising global tensions, this decision could end up crippling the machine that made China so wealthy. The crown jewel? The People's Liberation Army Rocket Force, or ARF, an organization that manages conventional and nuclear missiles. But not everything surrounding the ARF has gone to plan. Many details regarding China's missiles and their nuclear strategies remain unconfirmed by open sources, likely for their own national security reasons. But there are some important facts publicly known about what type of weaponry and capabilities the ARF could have access to. China is known to have deployed road-mobile ICBMs as part of its nuclear deterrent triad, along with silo-based and submarine-launched capabilities. This nuclear deterrent triad is one that analysts have been trying to better understand and has many on the global stage fearing what a war with China would look like. America has been interested in learning more about each arm of the triad, but more recently, the silo-based and road-mobile ballistic missile capabilities have been of particular interest. To learn more about these bases, American intelligence officers have started to look to the skies using satellites to learn more. Satellite imagery analysis has identified certain areas in remote western regions of China as potential operating areas for road-mobile ICBM units. Each base is given a single identifier, a number from 61 through 67. It's reported that Base 67 serves as the PRC's central nuclear weapons storage facility. The 67th base is located in Baoji City, Shaanxi Province. There are eyes in the sky covering the base, watching for trucks coming in and out and plotting construction transformations over time. More recently, with ARF monetary expansions, analysts are continuing to assess what's changing in the military landscape. Notably, there's a city called Hami, which is located in Xinjiang, in northwestern China. Some analysts have speculated that this general area could potentially host deployment locations or facilities related to China's road-mobile ICBM forces. To that end, satellite images shared by the Federation of American Scientists, FAS, point to the likelihood of a missile silo field in Hami's deserts. Specifically, there's a 250-foot by 180-foot structure that's been seen from above on July 25, 2021, and matches a similar blueprint to a known missile training site photographed in Jilantai that same year. However, there isn't definitive publicly available information specifically confirming the existence of a major missile field or operating base for ICBMs near Hami, and other experts warn that some of the silos seen by our defense satellites are likely to never be filled with real missiles, but with decoys. Now let's get to the elephant in the room: China's nuclear strategy and no first use policy. While this may seem alarming, it's important to note that China's official nuclear policy is described as a self-defensive nuclear strategy, and that historically, China has stored their nuclear warheads separately from their missile launching systems unless there is a heightened level of threat. Their policies would indicate that they're not rushing to pull the trigger on a nuclear war. In 1992, China ratified the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, making it one of 5 states pledging to not use nuclear weapons as the go-to first weapon under any circumstances. China has pledged to what they call No First Use, NFU, meaning they say they will never launch nuclear weapons against any nuclear or non-nuclear nation, and to only use them in retaliation if attacked by nuclear weapons. The People's Liberation Army also pledges to deter other adversary countries from leaning toward nuclear options in wartime. This is known as minimum deterrence. China also publicly opposed engaging in a nuclear arms race, and they've even called for a complete prohibition and the thorough destruction of global nuclear weapons. In practice, this translates to the People's Liberation Army maintaining a modest, agile, and diversified nuclear triad. The fact of the matter is that intelligence indicates China's nuclear arsenal remains relatively small compared to what the US and Russia have, which is why China's scarcity, mobility, concealment, and advanced nuclear counterattack capabilities are much higher on America's radar than the bombs themselves. Estimates vary, but intelligence sources indicate that China's total nuclear warhead stockpile is believed to be in the low hundreds. But even with these outwardly ethical practices and self-defense policies, it's no wonder other leaders on the global stage have recently felt heightened fears about wars between China and Taiwan when so little is known about their nuclear triad of road, silo, and submarine launchers. Some of those fears and unanswered questions grew as President Xi's corruption purge at the end of 2023 took place. Here's what happened. More than a decade ago, Xi Jinping set out to clean up his once corrupt military. A probe into the recent sweeping military purge indicates that there have been efforts to ensnare more than a dozen senior officials in the last 6 months of 2023. These details indicate that this was China's largest crackdown on the country's military in modern history. The most recent purge came just before the new year. In the last week of December, China's top legislative body unseated 9 defense figures, including 5 top brass members linked to the missile force. 2 others were with the Equipment Development Department, which is charged with arming the military. Not even a week before that, China's main political advisory board removed 3 executives from missile manufacturers. Back in March of 2023, PLA Rocket Force Commander Wei Feng publicly resigned from his post. This was a planned departure following a regular duration of his tour, but strangely, he's not been seen publicly since. He wasn't the only official to vanish. Washington Post reporters noted that Chinese Defense Minister Li Shangfu was last seen in August of 2023 with authorities. He was meeting with higher-ups, while US officials said he was about to be removed from his post. Following the meeting, Li Shangfu hasn't made a public appearance, and on paper, he's been relieved of his duties. On the same day, Dong Jun, a Chinese ex-Navy chief with a South China Sea background, was named Li's replacement as defense minister. A month before that, in July of 2023, former Foreign Minister Qin Gang was outed from his post in the military, even as he remained absent for over a month. What's even more alarming, Qin was last seen in public on June 25th, seen walking side by side with Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Andrei Rudenko, who flew into Beijing to meet with officials. Qin was supposed to meet with EU officials in July, but China suddenly cancelled the talks without explanation. The Chinese military's official newspaper pledged on the 1st of this year to wage a war on the graft, signaling that more purges could be on the horizon. The purge totals 22 high-profile officials being stripped of their ranks, or going missing altogether. What's more alarming, American officials argue, is that these are just the removals and disappearances that Beijing has made public. They point out that the military doesn't typically announce removals or internal investigations, so these public comments and leaked information have raised eyebrows. It's even started to gain traction online. News of Li Shangfu's disappearance got traction on X thanks to a tweet from Rahm Emanuel, the US ambassador to Japan. Emanuel tweeted, "President Xi's cabinet lineup is now resembling Agatha Christie's novel And Then There Were None. First, Foreign Minister Qin Gang goes missing, then Rocket Force commanders go missing, and now Defense Minister Li Shangfu hasn't been seen in public for 2 weeks. Who's going to win this unemployment race? China's youth or Xi's cabinet?" Some US officials have worried that this purge is indicative of an ideology shift in China's defense and military strategy, but after the Bloomberg report from January of 2024, the newfound intelligence indicates that we may have nothing to worry about. Not even a week into the new year, Bloomberg's investigative journalists uncovered information from US intelligence which states that President Xi's military purge is a direct result of the widespread corruption attempting to undermine his efforts of modernizing the armed forces. Much of this corruption is said to be so concentrated inside the ARF that American officials now believe President Xi is less likely to initiate military action in the coming years. This is major news, considering the world has been holding its breath to see what would happen between China and Taiwan. According to the groundbreaking Bloomberg article, there are allegations that some of China's ICBMs were filled with water instead of actual rocket propellants, but the outlet did not say what sort of missiles had been filled with water or how they came to know that fact. Analysts have taken issue with this claim, noting that even if US intelligence reportedly detected issues with several of China's missiles during transportation and handling, they were likely dealing with their liquid-fueled road-mobile DF-41 ICBM. Even if the intelligence reported that the missiles appear to have been compromised, filled with engineered materials rather than functional rocket fuel, this would simply render the missiles ineffective. In other words, if China was using water as fuel for their missiles, it would be self-sabotaging and destroying the artillery. These defective ICBMs set off alarms within US intelligence about potential quality control problems in China's nuclear forces. The issues are alleged to have prompted the internal purge by Xi, targeting people he must have deemed responsible for the flawed weapons. If this is true, it could undermine China's claims of having an advanced and reliable nuclear deterrent capable of threatening the US homeland. However, the specifics remain classified US intelligence, and China has dismissed such reports as disinformation aimed at maligning its military capabilities. While the Bloomberg's article's claims are explosive if accurate, the article notes they are based on unnamed intelligence sources. The Bloomberg report also did not specify the exact site where the missile silo doors reportedly malfunctioned. China has officially denied the allegations as false propaganda intended to denigrate its military and strategic programs. But how are folks reacting to all of this? America's relationship with China and their growing military has always been a hot-button issue, so it's no wonder experts have been asked to comment on the developing situation. When the original Bloomberg story ran, spokespeople for the White House National Security Council didn't immediately comment. When asked about the US intelligence, Lieutenant Colonel Martin Miners, a Pentagon spokesman, said the Department of Defense's annual China report discusses Xi's efforts to strengthen and accelerate anti-corruption investigations. They didn't provide additional details. Stephen Bryan, who served as a staff director of the Northeast Subcommittee of the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee and as a Deputy Undersecretary of Defense, was skeptical about the theory of using water to replace fuel. For an op-ed article posted on January 9, 2024, for the Asia Times, Bryan said that the idea that water is substituted for fuel is preposterous. Corrosion-prone rockets are kept empty until needed. Articles about the ICBM DF-5B seem to back up Bryan's comments. The corrosive and hazardous nature of the liquid fuel means the missiles are often sitting with empty tanks and are fueled just before launch. Reports even note that if a missile has been filled with fuel ahead of a launch, but the mission is scrubbed, the missile has to have the fuel emptied immediately and have its tanks cleansed with valves and seals replaced. Brian also claims that the intelligence, originally cited by Bloomberg, leads to more major questions than substantial answers, noting that from his background experience, President Xi is trying to cover up something else. Brian believes that water in missiles and silo lids that don't close are smoke and mirrors, and that our US intelligence should be really focusing on the generals and ministers being purged from the Chinese military. He asks, would President Xi really reach as far down into the military ranks as he has, unless there's a more serious reason? Alfred Wu, an associate professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore, agrees, telling Reuters that analysts should look at the evidence of internal corruption over equipment procurement by the PLA rocket force. More heads will roll, Wu said. The purge that centered around the rocket force is not over. Yun Sun, the director of the China program at the Stimson Center, a Washington, D.C.-based think tank, believes this purge could leave the ARF temporarily weakened. No one with that type of power wants to feel backed into a corner or humiliated on the world stage. The strategic nuclear force is what China relies on as the bottom line of its national security and the last resort on Taiwan, said Sun. It will take some time for China to clean up the mess and restore confidence in the rocket force's competence and trustworthiness. It means for the time being, China is at a weaker spot. Online sleuths seem to have their own theories about what this could all mean. One Redditor suggested that saying the missiles were filled with water is actually a translation error, since in Chinese the word pumping water and exaggerate share the same writing. Similarly, a YouTube commenter shared that guan shui literally translates to fill water as a blanket Chinese slang term used to describe replacing any material with cheaper substandard material to increase profit margin. This would again explain why water was specifically brought up in the US intelligence. Another Redditor said that they believe it's possible the top brass who were fired from the ranks had their titles stripped as a result of not being able to procure enough fuel. However, speculation about what happened to the Chinese generals who have been purged has spread like wildfire, with many people speculating that these individuals may not be alive anymore, citing the PLA's emphasis on staying vigilant against graft, citing a battle against corruption in their New Year's Day statement. Developing US intelligence argues that China's ongoing military purge has stemmed from serious equipment issues. These issues, put on blast for the global stage, show Xi's army and the rocket force as China's main nuclear arm, as weak and incapable of carrying out attacks, like the very attacks many fear against Taiwan. To that end, many point to the recent downfall of generals, top brass disappearances, and internal affair investigations as to the real problem, raising questions about whether there's been proper oversight into these massive military investments. These problems will likely dissuade China from risking any military clashes in the near term. But what do you think about China's military modernization? Is China really upgrading, or is it all just numbers and show? Let us know in the comments. Now go and check out why China's man-made military islands are a disaster, or click this other video instead. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more great military content. Why and in what way are the Philippines important to US Pacific strategy? In the 1990s and 2000s, the United States could afford to bask in its victory over the Soviet Union, as no other state in the international system was capable of challenging its global preeminence. That rapidly changed in the 2010s, as the economic and military rise of China upended American foreign policy. For the first time since the Cold War, the United States faced a near-peer competitor in a region of the world, the Indo-Pacific, which had become the engine of the global economy. America's costly Middle Eastern adventures in the War on Terror had contributed to a lack of full readiness to meet the new challenge, and national security experts in Washington had warned that slowly but surely, the United States was losing its traditional military advantage in the region, as China rapidly began to modernize its armed forces and concentrate hard power in the seas and skies of the First Island chain, where the world's most strategic trade routes transited. The pivot to Asia strategy of the Obama administration signaled that the United States now had a new top foreign policy priority: contain China's ambitions and prevent it from becoming a regional superpower in the Indo-Pacific. The Trump and Biden administrations both continued and expanded this policy, making it a rare area of bipartisan consensus in the increasingly polarized world of American politics. Unsurprisingly, as part of this containment policy, all three administrations have heavily courted the Philippines. In this video, we will look at the relationship between the two countries and at just how important the Philippines is to American geopolitical strategy in the Indo-Pacific region. The United States and the Philippines have a deep relationship that goes back to 1898. when it became an American colony after the Spanish-American War. After the brutal Philippine-American War and Moro Rebellion, the colony was peaceful for a time, until it saw some of the worst fighting in World War II. The Philippines achieved its full independence from the United States in 1946, but America retained military bases there until 1992, when the Navy handed over its base on Subic Bay to the Filipino government. The closing of the base seemed to mark a turning point not only for the Filipino-American relationship, but for the region, as it was the last US military outpost in Southeast Asia. With the Cold War over and the United States the world's undisputed hegemon, there seemed to be no need for such a presence. However, the Mutual Defense Treaty, MDT, between the United States and the Philippines, which came into force in 1951, remained on the books. The MDT would play a critical role in America's return to its former colonial possession. The rise of China changed the equation in the region, and in 2012, the new reality affected the Philippines in a dramatic way. In that year, China seized control of the Scarborough Shoal, an atoll with valuable fisheries and hydrocarbon reserves that rests within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone, as per the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, UNCLOS. However, China ignored UNCLOS and claimed that the shoal was its territory based on its infamous 9-line map, which it uses to assert ownership of 90% of the South China Sea. By the summer, Chinese Coast Guard and fishing vessels had excluded Filipino ships from the Scarborough Shoal, walling off its lagoon. China has effectively controlled the territory ever since, but the dispute over the Scarborough Shoal continues to this day, despite the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague ruling against China in 2016. On December 10, 2023, Chinese Coast Guard and maritime militia vessels used water cannons to disrupt the resupply of Filipino fishermen by civilian ships off the Scarborough Shoal. Other Filipino ships were rammed, and one of them suffered engine damage. The incident was the latest display of Filipino vulnerability to Chinese territorial expansion in these critical waterways. Shortly after seizing the Scarborough Shoal, China ramped up its drive for territory in the South China Sea. It took the Spratly Islands, which lie close to the Philippines, and eventually fortified them with artificial islands that host military infrastructure such as radar stations, missile silos, anti-aircraft and anti-ship weapons, and even in some cases airfields. With China's military presence in the region growing and the Filipino military in no condition to dispute Beijing's moves, there was little choice but for the Philippines to renew its military alliance with the United States. The first step in the process came in 2014 with the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, EDCA. The EDCA brought American troops back to the Philippines for the first time in over 20 years. Under this agreement, the Philippines granted new bases for the United States Armed Forces to operate on its territory, although it retained ownership of the sites. Additionally, the terms of the EDCA state that the United States must cover the cost of the bases, although it does not need to pay rent. The Philippines not charging such rent demonstrated how important a renewed American military presence in the area became for Manila. Initially, 5 locations were agreed to host American forces. One of them was Fort Magsaysay in Nueva Ecija. The others were unsurprisingly concentrated further south, toward the disputed waters of the South China Sea. One of the new bases, Antonio Batista Air Base, was very close to the contested Spratly Islands, giving the United States the ability to rapidly project power to counter China's military buildup in the area. The southern dominant locations of the first 4 EDCA bases signaled Manila's priorities for the new partnership. It needed assistance in the South China Sea dispute and was worried about China's aggression and potential to seize more territory from the Philippines. For the United States, the EDCA presented new options for it to prevent China from becoming a regional hegemon in the Indo-Pacific and for maintaining freedom of navigation in the economically and geopolitically critical South China Sea. So while it did not receive financial assistance under the EDCA in the way it does for its bases in Japan and South Korea, Washington was more than happy to pay the costs if it meant a renewed foothold in Southeast Asia. However, the burgeoning renewal of military ties between the Philippines and the United States would soon meet a snag. The EDCA was negotiated and signed by Filipino President Benigno Aquino III, who served from 2010 to 16, and saw the South China Sea dispute ramp up. His successor, Rodrigo Duterte, was far more skeptical about the United States. In fact, he announced the Philippines' separation from Washington during his first year in office. Many international observers accuse Duterte's administration of having authoritarian tendencies, where extrajudicial killings of suspected drug traffickers were permitted. Abroad, Duterte announced early that he would pursue an independent foreign policy. Technically, this policy is mandated in the Filipino constitution, but in practice, it meant that despite the bitter South China Sea dispute, Duterte tried to forge closer relations with Beijing and Moscow in an attempt to reduce the Philippines' dependence on the United States. On a 2016 trip to Beijing, Duterte said, "America has lost. I've aligned myself in your ideological flow." Because of Duterte's foreign policy, the EDCA's full implementation faced numerous delays between 2016 and 2021. For example, on February 11, 2020, Duterte reached the height of his aversion to the United States and announced he would be ending the US-Philippines Visiting Forces Agreement (VFA). The VFA allows American troops to easily deploy to the Philippines to address emergencies or potential contingencies, such as the event of an invasion of Taiwan. The VFA's clauses state that the agreement will remain in place for 180 days after the announcement of a cancellation. Duterte subsequently authorized 2 extensions in June and November of 2020, and the VFA was never cancelled in reality. If it had been cancelled, it would not have voided the MDT, though it would have made implementing it and the EDCA much harder. It amounted to little more than hot air in the end, but the episode showed how far the Philippines had drifted out of America's orbit during most of Duterte's presidency. Then, late in 2021, Duterte abruptly began to change course. Manila endorsed the AUKUS nuclear submarine deal, re-established the Philippines-United States bilateral strategic dialogue, and announced that joint military exercises would be expanded. External pressures had forced his hand. In early 2020, Chinese militia boats encircled the Philippines' T2 island to prevent the Filipinos from making infrastructure improvements on it. A year later, China authorized its Coast Guard to fire upon foreign vessels if required. Meanwhile, China's promised infrastructure investment in the Philippines, which Duterte hoped would help fulfill his build, build, build infrastructure plan, never materialized. Rodrigo Duterte's term as president ended on June 30, 2022. His successor, Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr., was much more aggressive in distancing the Philippines from China and restoring ties with the United States. The EDCA, after facing so many delays under Duterte, was reinvigorated in November 2022, with $66.5 million worth of project improvements at the first 5 locations. The new construction projects included training facilities, warehouses, and other vital infrastructure. The EDCA accelerated in its scope in April 2023, with 4 new bases being announced. Their locations were concentrated in the northern Philippines, with the clear aim of deterring an invasion of Taiwan. The addition of Taiwan to the EDCA's mission, even if unofficial, indicates a security partnership between the Philippines and the United States that is expanding in its purview. To prove the point, the new bases were followed up with the first quadrilateral defense meeting between the United States, Australia, Japan, and the Philippines in June, which took place between the countries' respective defense chiefs. The Philippines has participated in more joint exercises since Marcos took power, giving its military valuable experience and increasing its readiness for a confrontation in the Indo-Pacific region. It seems likely that the Philippines will soon join South Korea, New Zealand, and Vietnam in the Quad Plus arrangement. For the United States, the presence of the Philippines within its coalition in the Indo-Pacific region cannot be overstated in its importance. The Philippines does not have the economic or military might of the Quad members, but geographically, it's on par with Japan in its importance. The Philippines is part of the first island chain, which forms a natural barrier to containing China's military expansion into the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The Luzon Strait between the Philippines and Taiwan is one of the strategic shipping lanes through which the United States Navy and Air Force can potentially cut off Chinese trade. The new bases in the Philippines make this operation far easier to carry out, adding to the United States' leverage over China and enhancing deterrence against a potential invasion of Taiwan. Meanwhile, in March 2021, the United States announced plans to station new missiles around the first island chain as part of a military spending package over the following 6 years. Part of the new missile arsenal will likely include the Precision Strike Missile, which is the coming replacement for the ATACMS. This weapon, a short-range ballistic missile, will have an effective range of 500 kilometers, with the ability to deliver cluster munition-compliant payloads. In addition to their precision strike capabilities over such long ranges, These missiles can be launched from mobile systems like HIMARS, making them harder for enemy missiles to detect. There can also be more of them taking to the skies at a given time, because HIMARS launchers can carry 2 precision strike missiles as opposed to 1 ATACMS. The US Army received its first batch of precision strike missiles in December 2023. Their arrival would assist the United States' goal of reinforcing a conventional deterrence in the Indo-Pacific region that many national security experts in Washington believe has been eroded over recent history. While there have been no formal announcements, it's almost certain that some of the announced missiles will include the precision strike missile. It's also likely that some of these missiles will be placed in the EDCA bases in the Philippines. Although the precision strike missile does not have the range to cross the distance from the Philippines to the Chinese mainland, it can hit China's artificial islands if placed in locations like Antonio Batista Air Base. More importantly, the precision strike missile would play a large role in combating an invasion of Taiwan. The distance between Taiwan and the northern Philippines is only about 250 kilometers. A series of hard-to-find HIMARS launchers based in the northern Philippines would disrupt and make a potential invasion more costly. HIMARS launch precision strike missiles near one of the new EDCA sites in particular, Naval Base Camilo Osayas at the very northern edge of the Philippines, could be particularly damaging to any Chinese invasion effort. Although the base would be targeted in a confrontation, as we have seen in Ukraine, HIMARS launchers are easy to hide, which is one of the reasons why the National Defense College of the Philippines called for their presence on Filipino soil. Washington was happy to oblige. HIMARS launchers have already taken part in military exercises on Bosco Island in the northern Philippines. These drills likely simulate how they would be used in a scenario of an attempted Chinese invasion of Taiwan. American and Filipino armed forces have also conducted live-fire drills involving HIMARS and defensive systems like the Patriot missile. These exercises came on the coast of the South China Sea, where their intent was clear. The United States is developing other missiles with longer range. Another weapon the NDCP called for stationing on Filipino soil is the coming long-range hypersonic weapon. This weapon is designed to have a range of 1,725 miles, enough to reach targets in the Chinese mainland from the Filipino bases. To make matters better for Washington and Manila, the LRHW is a land-based, truck-launched weapon, which means it's easier to hide. The LRHW can reach velocities of 3,800 miles per hour. After launch, they move to the top of the atmosphere, staying beyond the reach of enemy missile defense systems, and then when ready to strike, make their descent, too late to be intercepted. The LRHW is designed specifically to defeat enemy anti-access area denial strategies of the type that is at the heart of China's strategy in the Indo-Pacific region. The LRHW uses a booster rocket motor to reach hypersonic velocities. Afterward, the glide vehicle detaches from this booster and can travel at speeds of Mach 5 or higher on its own. The US military's deployment of this weapon has suffered delays. Tests in October 21 and June 22 proved unsatisfactory. In September 2023, the Army admitted that it would not be able to meet its goal of deploying the LRHW by the end of fiscal year 2023. Once deployed, though, the LRHW will add new dimensions to conventional deterrence in the Indo-Pacific region. Their being based in the Philippines will be geographically critical to deterring China's ambitions for the South China Sea and an invasion of Taiwan. Despite Rodrigo Duterte's high personal popularity, polling data in the Philippines shows that most Filipinos did not agree with him on a separation from the United States and for closer ties to China. Public opinion on America remains high within the country, while most Filipinos have little regard for China. In a June 2022 scientific survey of 1,200 adults in the Philippines, respondents suggested that their country should trust the United States, Japan, and Australia the most, while trusting China and Russia the least. 31% of those surveyed said they had a great deal of trust in the United States, while 58% said that the United States should be given at least a fair amount of trust, making for a total trust rating of 89%. 79% trusted Japan, and 78% placed their trust in Australia. Only 38% trusted Russia, and 33% trusted China. On the flip side, 36% of Filipinos said their country should extend not too much trust in China, while 31% said China should not be trusted at all, making for a total distrust rate of 67%. The sample had a 95% confidence interval at an error rate of plus or minus 2.8%. When Ferdinand Marcos Jr. was elected president of the Philippines, It was no coincidence that his first congratulatory call came from Joe Biden. According to family members and other sources close to Marcos, he was personally flattered by the speed and attentiveness of the call. Marcos subsequently took 2 trips to the United States in less than a year, and high-level officials in the Biden administration responded in kind. There has been some controversy, given Marcos's parentage and ties to the late dictator's regime, but security considerations always win out over economic or moral ones in international relations, and Washington has proven keen to regard the past as water under the bridge. There is good reason for the charm offensive. The Philippines is a critically important staging ground in any scenario involving Taiwan and in preserving the integrity of the First Island chain, the primary line of defense against Chinese military expansion into the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The balance of power in the region has indeed eroded, as China's buildup of missiles, ships, planes, and troops has tipped the scale of hard power away from the United States. China's potential with hypersonic weapons has made this eroding deterrent clearer. China can concentrate all of these forces in the region, while the United States is divided into many global commitments. Therefore, America is counting on its alliances with the First Island chain countries to act as a geopolitical force multiplier. The Philippines is critical along that chain of containment. China had an opportunity to bring the Philippines far closer to its orbit and potentially break through the First Island chain during the Duterte presidency. There was even a plan for Chinese companies to take over a shipyard in Subic Bay, the site of the American naval base that had shuttered in 1992. However, senior Filipino government officials worked behind the scenes to kill that deal. They did not trust China, which had not altered its aggressive behaviors in the region. These behaviors, such as bullying Filipino ships out of their internationally recognized territorial waters and not delivering on their Belt and Road-related economic development promises, ultimately meant that Beijing could not take advantage of the Duterte presidency to alter the geostrategic situation in the region. China has long been a country that has failed to live up to its fullest potential. The geopolitical alignment of the Philippines might prove to be just the latest example in that history. Some Filipinos and international observers speculate that Sara Duterte, Rodrigo Duterte's daughter and current vice president of the Philippines, could one day ascend to the higher office and follow her father's policies regarding Beijing. But for now, that's just speculation. The renewal of ties between the Philippines and the United States and the buildup of infrastructure there are critical to the national security interests of both countries. And with such high stakes, relationships tend to have a ghost-in-the-machine dynamic. Rodrigo Duterte's presidency was a good example of this in action. What do you think about the renewal of ties between the United States and the Philippines? How important is the Philippines to America's national security strategy? And how important is the presence of American troops on Filipino soil to that country's well-being in the Indo-Pacific region? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, don't forget to leave a like and hit the subscribe button for more military analysis from military experts. China's plan to invade the relatively small yet globally significant island of Taiwan may be hitting a major roadblock. The Philippines, backed by the US, could influence China's invasion plans in a major China-Taiwan conflict. But what is it about the Philippines that makes them play such a pivotal role in this scenario? In the year 2023, Taiwan became the most strategically important piece of real estate on Earth. This de facto independent island nation, 110 miles off the coast of the Chinese mainland, sits at the center of the world's economic and geopolitical fault lines. Since it came to power in 1949, the Chinese Communist Party has regarded Taiwan as a renegade province, a relic left over from its long civil war and the century of humiliation it climaxed. This was the period between 1839 and 1949, where China repeatedly found itself invaded, defeated, occupied, and partitioned by foreign powers. Taiwan's self-governing status is a reminder to the Chinese leadership of those times, and reunifying it with the mainland is one of the most important objectives for China's authoritarian leader, Xi Jinping, who hopes that the process will be completed by 2049, the centennial of the Chinese Communist Party's ascendancy to power. There are many obstacles to this plan, but one of them is not so often cited: the Philippines. Let's take a look at the Philippines, its tense relationship with China, and how this nation threatens Beijing's grandest foreign policy ambition. Taiwan is important to the Chinese leadership not just for historical reasons, but because of its economic and geostrategic position. Economically, Taiwan hosts the world's most advanced semiconductor industry through the dominance of one company. the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC. In 2021, Taiwan had 63% of the world's semiconductor market share, with 54% of the world total being through TSMC alone. These chips are at the heart of the world's digital economy and power everything from computers to the brake sensors in cars. For China, gaining control of this industry would be very desirable. Placing itself at the heart of the globe's high-technology supply chain has been a major priority for its geopolitical strategy, as seen in its Made in China 2025 plan. If the semiconductor shortage of the past few years made things more expensive, Beijing getting to dictate the supply chain of these vital components would increase the price tag of almost everything much further. Geopolitically, Taiwan also sits at the center of the First Island Chain, the series of islands that span from Japan to Indonesia. These islands act as a natural obstacle to China's expansion into the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Restoring Taiwan to Beijing's rule would break this chain and allow China to freely access the world's oceans without having to go through the choke points that the First Island Chain presents, such as the Strait of Malacca or the Miyako Strait. Controlling these choke points is one of the United States Navy's principal strategies for containing Chinese military expansion. If China were to take Taiwan, however, it would have the land and ports it needs to bypass those choke points, making containment much more difficult, if not impossible. The United States is Taiwan's most important potential ally. Officially, America treats Taiwan with a doctrine of strategic ambiguity, neither confirming nor denying that it would come to the island's defense if it were to be invaded. But under the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979, it has long sold sophisticated weapons to the island nation to deter such an invasion from happening. With this equipment, Taiwan has pursued what it calls a porcupine strategy, fortifying itself as heavily as possible and building offensive assets to deal damage to the Chinese mainland, all to increase the costs China would incur for an invasion and hold out as long as it can while it awaits the aid of its allies. Japan would also play an important role in the defense of Taiwan. In December 2021, the late former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe said the United States and Japan would not be able to stand idly by if Taiwan were attacked. In 2022, only a few months before his shocking assassination, he urged the United States to drop strategic ambiguity and affirmatively say it would defend Taiwan. A Taiwan contingency is a Japan contingency, he said, because China establishing air superiority around Taiwan would cover Japanese airspace. A takeover of Taiwan would also allow China to threaten Japanese shipping even more than it does today with its militarization of the South China Sea. Japan is a resource-poor nation and must import raw materials and commodities to survive. It cannot allow China to dictate what goes on in the region's shipping lanes. However, for all the talk about Japan and its role in a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan, far fewer people talk about the role the Philippines would play in such a scenario. Thanks to a renewed agreement with the United States, this is starting to change, and Taiwan may soon be able to count on the aid of the Philippines as it stares down the colossus across the strait. The Philippines, though much smaller than the United States and Japan, also has a keen interest in seeing that Taiwan does not become subject to the Chinese Communist Party, and the Philippines has now become a major player in the dispute over Taiwan. The entrance of the Philippines into the Taiwan question is a natural consequence of the diplomatic and military rivalry between it and China, which has occurred in the last decade. The Philippines and China have long had a bitter dispute over the waters of the South China Sea. In 2012, China seized control of the Scarborough Shoal, a rock with valuable fishing sites and hydrocarbon reserves that rests within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. It was the start of a conflict between China and the Philippines over several rocks and island chains in the South China Sea. Other points of contention between the two nations include Mischief Reef and the Spratly Islands, all of which China went on to occupy and fortify. The Philippines brought a suit in international court, and in 2016, a tribunal in The Hague ruled that all of China's territorial claims in the South China Sea, based on a 9-line map drawn in the late 1940s, had no legal basis. Still, China ignored the ruling and occupies these rocks and islands to this day. China's aggressive policy in the area has naturally alienated the Philippines, which is a longtime ally of the United States. The United States has had bases throughout the Philippines since the Spanish-American War of 1898, but its presence is now starting to expand much more. The Filipino military is not a formidable fighting force, meaning that China has mostly been able to get its way in its disputes with the Philippines. despite the international tribunals ruling against it. The Philippines has an active army of about 100,000 active duty personnel, a navy with only a few vessels more fit for fighting than patrol boats, and about 25 combat aircraft. This means that militarily, the Philippines would contribute little to the defense of Taiwan, at least for now. However, the Philippines does have two advantages: its geographical position and its alliance with the United States, which it has now begun to ramp up ties with again after a period of frostier relations. In 2014, as the South China Sea dispute began to ramp up, the United States and the Philippines signed the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, EDCA. Under the terms of the EDCA, the United States would be able to expand its military presence in the Philippines, although the 2014 document did not specifically state where it would do this. Rather, the document only affirmed the principle that the armed forces of the Philippines would provide new locations for the United States Armed Forces. In 2016, 5 such locations were formally announced. These were, from north to south, Fort Magsaysay in Nueva Ecija, Besa Air Base in Pampanga, Mactan Benito Ebuen Air Base in Cebu, Antonio Bautista Air Base, and Lumbia Air Base in Cagayan de Oro. Of the 2016 locations, Antonio Bautista Air Base was the most important, as it was close to the disputed Spratly Islands in the South China Sea. However, as China's military buildup in the region has only grown since 2016, the United States and Philippines announced plans to further accelerate the EDCA in February 2023. In April, the Pentagon announced the creation of 4 new EDCA bases. These are Naval Base Camilo Osayas in Santa Ana, Cagayan, Camp Melchor de la Cruz in Gamu, Isabela, Balabac Island in Palawan, and Laulo Airport in Cagayan. Not coincidentally, 3 of these 4 locations are in the northern Philippines, which makes the intentions of that expansion clear. The new bases are to help deter a potential invasion of Taiwan by allowing the United States to more easily project power into a critical area, the Luzon Strait. The Luzon Strait is one of the first island chain's strategic choke points. It is a 160-mile gap of water between the Philippines and Taiwan. The Philippines' northernmost island, Mavulis, is even closer, at only 118 miles away from the world's most disputed hotspot. Here is where we see the role that the Philippines would play in the defense of the world's most hotly contested island. In the first place, the bases give the United States and its regional allies additional options to choke off shipping to China. As China is heavily dependent on foreign food and energy imports, this is something that the country's leadership will need to take seriously and helps aid the process of deterrence. Geographically, the bases strengthen a potential new front to counter a Chinese invasion of Taiwan if deterrence fails and hostilities actually become a reality. In the necessary amphibious operation, China would now likely be facing a pincer movement of forces moving south from Japan and north from the Philippines, adding to the already immense difficulty of pulling off a successful waterborne maneuver and establishing a beachhead across the Strait of Taiwan. An amphibious invasion is hard enough. An amphibious invasion that would need to fend off American and Allied forces on 2 sides, that would be almost impossible, especially with a lack of surprise on the invaders' side. The bases also better prepare the United States and its other allies in the region, such as its Quad partners Japan and Australia, for war. Their locations make them ideal places to stage military exercises simulating an invasion of Taiwan. Although there is no true substitute for actual combat operations, the better prepared military force will usually get the better of an engagement, something the Chinese brass should know well, since the principle goes all the way back to Sun Tzu. The new bases in the Philippines certainly increase the preparation the United States and its allies can make for a coming invasion. The renewed military partnership between the United States and the Philippines also offers the prospect of improving that country's military readiness as well, which, as we have seen, is badly needed. As China's policy in the region has routinely seen the Philippines bullied, it is likely that policymakers in Manila will want to take advantage of the opportunity that the new bases provide. Indeed, the United States and the Philippines have already conducted drills in the Luzon Strait, which will lead to improved Filipino readiness in the long run. Someday soon, the Philippines could join joint exercises not only with the United States, but with its partners in the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, Japan, Australia, and possibly even India. The new bases in the Philippines also help to reduce one of China's major advantages, which had been eroding the United States' share of the military balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region. Namely, the bases help to mitigate the tyranny of distance. This term describes the disadvantage the United States would face by fighting thousands of miles away from its homeland. It would need to ship troops, supplies, and other essentials over those thousands of miles of ocean, where China's troops and supplies would only need to travel a little bit from their homeland. The vast distance also has a negative effect on morale at the home front, because it makes Americans wonder what the war is really about. This was a big factor in contributing to the political controversies in America's interventions in Vietnam and Iraq, and it is a tradition that goes back to the earliest days of the country's history. With China's development of anti-access area denial (A2AD) capabilities, the tyranny of distance has magnified. The long American supply lines would make ripe targets for China's A2AD strategy, but the bases in the Philippines give the United States more options. It can now position many more assets close to the area where the fighting over Taiwan would be taking place, making China's A2AD harder to carry out. For example, China has an arsenal of thousands of ballistic missiles that threatens all of America's bases in the region. But the more targets there are to hit, and the more air defense systems get concentrated along the bases, the faster China's missile depletion becomes. Some of the missiles will hit, but the bases in the Philippines mean that now China has more targets to hit and more air defense systems to deal with. The bases in the Philippines ultimately mean the attrition math will shift more in favor of the United States and its allies, even though they would still take terrible damage in an all-out Chinese missile attack. Still, surviving assets can more confidently be brought forward to act when the reign of missiles ends. In this way, the new bases in the Philippines are in line with the United States' third offset strategy, which it codified in the mid-2010s. Meanwhile, the new base means that the United States will be able to position more assets that can hit the Chinese mainland too, further undermining China's A2AD strategy and increasing the costs of a conflict exponentially and further aiding deterrence. The agreement with the Philippines, however, prohibits the deployment of nuclear weapons in the bases, so the EDCA is not a nuclear umbrella type of agreement. That is one of the few items of solace for the Chinese leadership. For the Philippines, the renewal and expansion of the EDCA marks a return to its traditional close relationship with the United States. Despite the territorial disputes in the South China Sea, Rodrigo Duterte, president of the Philippines from 2016 to 2022, flirted with forging closer relations with China in order to reduce the country's dependence on the United States. His successor, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., has proven more traditional in pursuing the Philippines' alliance with the United States. The new base also includes an investment worth over $82 million for infrastructure and access to resources for those bases. This investment will be a good source of jobs for local Filipino residents, meaning that they aid the United States not only in its projection of military power, but economic influence. Therefore, aside from the military balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region, the bases also affect one of the cornerstones of Chinese policy: economic coercion. China has long used its financial and industrial power to exert leverage over the domestic politics of other nations. We have even witnessed this in action in the United States, with certain Hollywood filmmakers carefully curating their content to not offend Chinese sensibilities, and the 2019 controversy in the NBA about the fate of Hong Kong, which was erupting with protests at the time. The effects are far more profound elsewhere. For example, China has used its economic leverage over many Muslim-majority nations to buy their silence regarding the treatment of its Muslim Uyghur population in its western Xinjiang province, which the United States State Department, the British Parliament, and several other governments around the world have formally classified as genocide. China's infrastructure investments through its Belt and Road Initiative, among other projects, have also given it leverage over countries receiving the funds. Although the Philippines is technically a member of the Belt and Road Initiative, its Chinese-sponsored infrastructure development there has only been limited and is highly controversial among the Filipino public. Despite China's attempts to make inroads, the United States and its respective companies remain the heaviest source of foreign investment in the Philippines. The situation has limited the Chinese government's ability to exert economic coercion over that country. In the past, Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership could have hoped to buy at least the neutrality of the Philippines concerning the Taiwan issue, but with the new bases and both the military and economic ties that it brings with the United States, this possibility just got sharply reduced. The failure of China to bring the Philippines into its orbit, despite the 6 years of friendly Duterte presidency, severely threatens Beijing's plans for Taiwan. Geographically, the Philippines is just too important to the success or failure of an operation to take the island. The Philippines now actively coming onto the side of the United States makes the already difficult operation even more difficult for China, and the problem is only likely to get worse for Beijing. Unlike China, the Philippines is increasing in population. It is expected to increase from the current 117 million to about 180 million by the end of the century. Meanwhile, China's population peaked in about 2020 and is now declining. It is expected to shrink from 1.4 billion to about 776 million by the end of the century. The Philippines' economy is growing as well, with an average annual GDP growth of 6.4% since 1990. As the Philippines' population economy grows, it will be an even better source for American investment, and the new wealth will give the Philippines the opportunity to expand its military power in the future. Add this reality to China's economic and demographic problems, and the window for the mainland to reunify with the island through use of force might be closing rapidly. Unsurprisingly, the Chinese government was not happy about the renewal of the EDCA and the expansion of American military bases and financial investment in the Philippines. When the news came, the Chinese Foreign Ministry accused the United States and Philippines of increasing tension in the region and helping to destabilize it. For the Philippines, though, there is little choice but to strengthen its ties with the United States. As another country in the first island chain, it would be even more subjected to China's whims if it took control of Taiwan. Just like Japan, its airspace would be under threat if China controlled the skies over Taiwan. Its shipping and maritime commerce, already under stress from China's occupation of strategic real estate in the South China Sea, would be that much more inhibited. When seen in this light, it was probably foolish for the Chinese leadership to believe that the Philippines would ever come under its orbit to the extent that countries in the Eurasian interior would. In the affairs of nations, security considerations will almost always win out over economic considerations. Because of its geopolitical position, the Philippines cannot let China secure a hegemonic position in the Indo-Pacific region, which it would do if Taiwan were to fall. Therefore, it is in the interest of the Philippines to forge ties with and host the military of the only nation that can prevent such a thing from happening, the United States. China may have thought time was on its side, but the renewal of the EDCA might just mean that by 2049, China will be unable to attempt an invasion of Taiwan, let alone actually succeed in its plan. But what do you think? Do the new American bases in the Philippines shift the region's balance of power and threaten China's plans to invade Taiwan? If so, how heavily? Let us know in the comments. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. How does a small nation avoid being swallowed by a colossal neighbor? This age-old question continues to haunt global politics and shapes the strategies of many countries today. Take Ukraine in 1994, just after the Soviet Union's dissolution. With the world's third-largest nuclear arsenal suddenly under its control, Ukraine faced a critical decision. The Budapest Memorandum seemed like a safety net, offering security assurances from Russia, the US, and other Western powers in exchange for Ukraine surrendering its nuclear weapons. However, this deal, lacking the teeth of a formal military alliance, failed to protect Ukraine from further aggression, showcasing the potential pitfalls of relinquishing such a powerful deterrent. Now, as China's military clout grows under Xi Jinping's assertive leadership, smaller nations in the Indo-Pacific are on edge, drawing parallels to Ukraine's past predicaments. In this video, we delve into the strategic shifts of Vietnam and Indonesia, two nations ensnared in the contentious South China Sea disputes. Both countries staunchly oppose China's expansive 9-dash line claim, with Vietnam facing the most immediate threats. Join us as we explore how these nations are adapting their foreign policies to avoid Ukraine's fate, striving for security in a region shadowed by a looming superpower. Vietnam shares a land border with China that is 806 miles long. In early 1979, this border became the stage for a conflict between the two countries. 220,000 troops from China's People's Liberation Army attacked all 6 of Vietnam's border provinces that February. They occupied 23 cities and towns, up to a penetration of about 25 miles into Vietnamese territory. 3 weeks after the invasion, China declared that its mission had been accomplished and went home. Truthfully, the PLA had not performed as well as Beijing had hoped for, although the casualty figures coming from both sides are untrustworthy. Minor border clashes on land continued until 1991, when Vietnam and China normalized their diplomatic relations in the wake of the end of the Cold War. This normalization marked the end of the land boundary dispute between China and Vietnam. However, the two continue to dispute maritime boundaries and have ever since China seized control of the Paracel Islands in 1974. The naval battle there saw the deaths of over 100 then South Vietnamese personnel. 48 more plus one American liaison officer were captured, 18 Chinese were killed, and 67 more wounded. Vietnam still claims the islands, but China has controlled them to this day. The two also claim control over the Spratly Islands and have fought a battle there too. In 1988, Vietnam and China clashed with each other at sea again, this time near Johnson's South Reef in the Spratlys. China again prevailed, with 64 Vietnamese sailors being killed in action. China has controlled the reef ever since and began militarizing it with air defense systems in 2016. There's also no telling whether or not China will reopen the land dispute with Vietnam again. China has been keen to raise outlandish territorial issues with all of its neighbors, even its supposed unlimited strategic partner, Russia. This is a calculated foreign policy move on the part of Beijing. The grey zone operations that result from these claims gradually wear down the resolve and resources of China's neighbors, allowing it to steadily gain ground in the region. This was precisely how China gained control of the Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines in 2012. It was also how China steadily pushed its claims on the disputed border with India, which saw a series of deadly confrontations between 2020 and 2022. As a result of having an aggressive great power for a neighbor that it has frosty relations with at the best of times, Vietnam is a highly militarized state. It's ranked third in the list of countries with the most total military personnel at 5.52 million, despite being 16th in world population with a little over 100 million. This puts Vietnam at having a military population of almost 57 per 1,000 people. However, of these personnel, only about 600,000 are on active duty. There are 5 million reservists and 250,000 paramilitary troops. China has the largest active standing army in the world, with almost 2.03 million active personnel. There are almost 510,000 reservists and 625,000 paramilitary troops in the Chinese military. China also has a decisive advantage in air power, tanks, armored vehicles, artillery, logistics, and of course, naval power. Vietnam's military may punch above its weight as it did in 1979, but it has no chance in an all-out confrontation. Vietnam is therefore gradually seeking new relationships in a burgeoning coalition to check the expansion of Chinese power in the Indo-Pacific region. This marks a departure from the country's traditional foreign policy, which is marked by 3 no's: no military alliances, no foreign military bases on Vietnamese territory, and no reliance on any country to combat others. Vietnam's only formal ally is its western neighbor Laos, with which it has ideological ties rooted in Marxism as much as it has shared security interests. Political obstacles have also prevented Vietnam from joining international alignments. Despite sharing a common security interest against China's expansionism, Vietnam's territorial disputes in the South China Sea involve the Philippines, Taiwan, and Malaysia. These disputes have prevented those countries from fully coalescing into a true coalition against Beijing's ambitions. Additionally, there are ideological issues. The US-led alliance network tends to have an ideological component, with the opposition to communism and support of multi-party democratic values as 2 vital components. Vietnam is still a one-party socialist state. The country's official constitutional name is the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. As much as the economic commitment to Marxist ideas in economics has waned over the decades, the insistence on liberal values by the United States and its allies still creates a point of contention between Vietnam and its potential partners in a coalition against China. Despite these obstacles, the past few years have been marked by a flurry of diplomatic activity from Hanoi. For example, Vietnam has cooperated in the Quad Plus framework. This framework is an expansion of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, the informal grouping of the United States, Japan, Australia, and India. Vietnam began to participate in some of these discussions as early as 2020, along with South Korea and New Zealand. The talks began with how these countries were handling the COVID-19 pandemic, as the Quad began to shift from a purely security-based conference to one which focused on broader issues. Vietnam has had a recurring presence in Quad Plus meetings since 2020. Vietnam has also gradually gotten itself involved in the economic and diplomatic network led by its former enemy, the United States. Since 2013, annual bilateral trade between the United States and Vietnam increased from $30 billion to $139 billion. Not coincidentally, President Biden paid a state visit to Vietnam in the autumn of 2023. There, he, alongside Nguyen Phu Trong, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Vietnam, declared that the two nations were elevating their bilateral relationship to a comprehensive strategic partnership. The partnership is ostensibly based on economic opportunities, giving Vietnam the ability to grow its economy through further American investment. Security issues were not emphasized in the official announcement of the new bilateral relationship. For the United States, though, the investments in Vietnam serve a security as well as an economic purpose, as they offer more options for American firms to move critical supply chains out of China. Beijing's behavior during the pandemic, when it threatened the global medical supply chain, forced Washington to double down on its efforts to relocate these manufacturing processes. It's also far from out of the question that the strategic partnership will eventually encompass a security dimension, as relations between the two countries improve in the face of new realities in the region. Vietnam has also struck up a growing partnership with America's Quad partner India. For India in particular, Vietnam is vital. It sits on the route of New Delhi's so-called Necklace of Diamonds strategy, the series of investments and bilateral relationships it hopes to forge to counter China's rival String of Pearls, which threatens to encircle India. India hopes that the Necklace of Diamonds will be a counter-encirclement of China, and Vietnam sits directly along that route. As such, India and Vietnam maintain good bilateral relations and have begun to strengthen their security ties independent of the Quad Plus framework. In 2020, India sold one patrol boat to Vietnam. Vietnam has also expressed interest in India's BrahMos ramjet supersonic cruise missile. However, after China raised concerns, the sale was not finalized. Vietnam has not yet signed on to any of India's strategic or infrastructure investments, but the country's gradual shift of its foreign policy is still in its relative infancy. As China continues its attempts to expand its influence in the region, India will likely serve as an ideal and necessary ally for the Vietnamese. The two nations share many mutual interests. Indonesia occupies a different seat at the region's table. It has a much friendlier relationship with China than Vietnam does. The two countries signed the Indonesia-China Strategic Partnership in 2005. Indonesia is also one of the biggest participants in China's Belt and Road Initiative, with almost $17 billion in Chinese capital invested there between 2014 and 2018 as part of the project. By December 2023, total Chinese investment in Indonesia amounted to nearly $44 billion. Bilateral trade in 2022 amounted to $73.4 billion, compared to the $27.19 billion in trade between Indonesia and the United States that year. Xi Jinping also has a close personal relationship with Indonesia's President Joko Widodo, who has been in office since 2014. Indonesia's geography affords it greater security from China's moves compared to Vietnam. It's located thousands of miles away from the Chinese mainland overseas. Consequently, it can have friendlier relations with Beijing. Nevertheless, even though the relationship between the two countries is good, there are underlying tensions which have come as a result of China's expansionist attitude in the region. Indonesia has not been involved in the most bitter battles of the South China Sea dispute like Vietnam has, but it still disputes China's 9-dash line. In particular, Indonesia has a contentious relationship with both China and Vietnam over the Natuna Islands which it governs. Although the islands slightly coincide with the 9-dash line, China renounced its claim over them in 1995, but not in a complete way. It still claims ownership of the rich oil and gas field northeast of the islands that was discovered 2 years earlier. Chinese and Vietnamese fishing boats have often come into these waters as well. On March 19, 2016, the Chinese Coast Guard rammed an Indonesian ship that had attempted to detain Chinese nationals for illegally fishing there. Indonesia's foreign ministry leveled a complaint with its Chinese counterpart 2 days later. Indonesia stepped up its destruction of illegal foreign fishing boats in response to this incident, and that June, President Widodo visited the Natuna Islands on a warship to demonstrate that his country would defend its sovereignty. The increase in tensions in the area eventually prompted the Indonesians to move one of their naval headquarters to the Natuna Islands to protect their country's territorial integrity. The move was in 2020, but that still didn't stop the Chinese Coast Guard from trying to interfere with Indonesian oil exploration in the area in December 2021. Perhaps unsurprisingly, public opinion of China in Indonesia began to decline through the 2010s, as Beijing threw its weight around under Xi Jinping. In a 2014 poll conducted by the BBC, 52% of Indonesians viewed Chinese influence in the area positively, compared to 28% that viewed it negatively. 7 years later, attitudes had changed significantly. Australia's Lowy Institute found that only 43% of Indonesians now thought that China's growth was good for their country. 60% said that Indonesia should join other countries to limit China's influence in the region. 48% thought that China's aim was to become the dominant power in Asia. Indonesia has in fact made some subtle moves to counter Chinese influence in the region, and China must be concerned about these moves because of Indonesia's strategic geography. The country occupies some of the most important real estate in the Indo-Pacific. Its most important geostrategic limitation of China is that its island of Sumatra occupies the southern part of the Strait of Malacca. This critical choke point has long been an object of worry for policymakers in Beijing. As early as 2003, then Chinese leader Hu Jintao warned of the threat that would come to China because of the actions of certain powers that aimed to control the Strait of Malacca. In 2016, almost 80% of China's oil imports came through this choke point. The volume of trade has only increased since then. China has attempted to develop alternative and less vulnerable routes through its investments in Pakistan and its relationship with Russia, but these have not yet replaced China's reliance on the strait. Cutting off shipping through the Strait of Malacca for only a week would increase the cost of global maritime trade by about $65 million. Every month would cost about $280 million, according to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Taking advantage of this geography, Indonesia has expanded its relationship with India, whose Andaman and Nicobar Islands lie only 90 nautical miles to the north of Sumatra. The Indian armed forces have a significant presence on these islands, with 7 air and naval bases, the country's only joint tri-service command, and further improvements coming. Missile batteries, more warships, drones, and soldiers are on their way. In 2023, the United States also gained some access to these islands, as the US Navy signed a 5-year Master Shipyard Repair Agreement (MSRA) with Larsen & Toubro Shipyard in Chennai. India can easily participate as a partner in this area should it choose to do so. India and Indonesia have cooperated in other ways too. Like the bilateral relationship with China, Jakarta and New Delhi have long had amicable relations, and the two countries work together at the level of a strategic partnership. Indonesia also has been keen to cooperate with India's grander ambitions. Unlike Vietnam, India has been a much more concrete partner in India's Necklace of Diamonds strategy. It granted India military access to its Sabang port, which occupies the northern entrance of the Strait of Malacca, in 2018. The military access includes Indian investments in improvements to the port. Indonesia and the United States have also steadily advanced their bilateral relations. In November 2023, a month after the announcement of the strategic partnership with Vietnam, President Biden hosted Widodo at the White House. There, the two leaders announced the new US-Indonesia Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. The partnership covered various economic initiatives. These included diversifying the semiconductor supply chain, American investments in Indonesian businesses, and improving the country's rural connectivity were also major items in the agreement. Indonesia is also a source of nickel, a vital component in the battery technology found in electric vehicles. American enterprises are keen to gain access to this resource. However, security items were also major components of the new partnership, a big difference from the one with Vietnam. The United States and Indonesia have had significant security ties for many years. Indonesia has long been a purchaser of the F-16. In 2022, it expanded this relationship by purchasing the F-15EX to replace its Russian Su-27 and Su-30 fighters. Expanding on these ties, the two countries signed a new defense cooperation arrangement as part of the new strategic partnership. Cybersecurity and counterterrorism were part of the agreement, as was American assistance to improve Indonesia's maritime domain awareness and sea enforcement. This provision will help to improve India's ability to confront the pirates that prowl its crowded waters, and more dramatically, will help it to keep an eye on Chinese maritime activities. Most importantly, this agreement includes provisions for joint exercises between the US and Indonesian militaries. The agreement was not an alliance, but did build on the burgeoning security relationship between the two countries. American and Indonesian forces conducting joint exercises and using some of the same equipment puts the two in position to undertake more significant operations if the need arises, like closing the Strait of Malacca to Chinese shipping. India's cooperation in this matter would be almost certain. Indonesia has not been a party to the Quad Plus talks and has not yet shown a willingness to become more deeply involved in multilateral efforts. However, Indonesia's status as the world's third-largest democracy, with free elections in a multi-party system, means there is less ideological friction between Washington and Jakarta than in the US-Vietnam relationship. should Indonesia choose to participate in the US-led network, it will have a smoother time doing so. Jakarta's overall foreign policy is in some degree a measure of balancing the United States and China against one another to ensure that it can maintain its independence. Indonesia's current president-elect, Prabowo Subianto, is a good personal example of this policy. As the Minister of Defense, he was the one responsible for procuring the purchases of the F-15EX. Yet he has also called China a friendly nation, criticized the West while stating Indonesia should learn from Asian nations including China, and entertained the notion of joining the BRICS bloc. Nevertheless, by strengthening its economic and military cooperation with the United States, which Subianto has not pledged to abandon, Indonesia has also set itself on a course to maximize its geopolitical advantage and exercise a greater amount of leverage over China. Becoming too aggressive against Indonesia carries far more costs for China than aggression against Vietnam. With these factors on its side, Indonesia is a lot less likely to become like Ukraine. When a great power begins to assert itself and disrupt the traditional balance in a region, lesser powers will need to reassess their go-to foreign policies. China's rise has served this purpose for both Vietnam and Indonesia, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine sets a stark reminder of what can happen to nations that have such an assertive great power for a neighbor. Indonesia seems to be adjusting more quickly than Vietnam. The latter is still reluctant to cast aside its traditional non-alignment. Nevertheless, Vietnam's gradual shift toward the growing coalition against Chinese influence in the Indo-Pacific region is inevitable. Security considerations will always be the most decisive factor in the foreign policy of a state. Since Vietnam's security situation is far more precarious than Indonesia's, Hanoi might well take a page out of Jakarta's playbook and upgrade its strategic partnership with the United States. Vietnam might not enjoy America's promotion of multi-party democracy, but it ultimately has little choice when an aggressive China sits right across the border. What further moves do you think Vietnam and Indonesia will make to ensure they do not become the subject of Chinese aggression in the region? Will Vietnam continue to shift its foreign policy toward alignment with its old enemy as conditions in Asia change? What will Subianto's taking power in October mean for the relationship between Indonesia and the United States? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Now go and check out Taiwan has a secret revenge plan for China, or click this other video instead.